So almost every guide on the Gen 4 AI gets things wrong. Most of them probably have copied each other, and a lot of them miss out on very important bugs and game interactions. I'm particularly aware of this video, which definitely needs correcting. So this is an attempt to fix that. It's my attempt to put multiple years of experience into a short video. We'll go over exactly how the AI switches, the special Gen 4 doubles AI behaviors, and a condensed list of what I picked out as the most important AI behaviors to know for the frontier, and any difficult ROM hacks. Each section is clearly marked, and a full transcript with examples is linked in the description. If there are any mistakes, this document will get updated. If you're experienced with Generation 4, you might want to skip ahead to some of the trap and bug sections. That's probably what's going to be new for you, or treat this like a quick test or recap as I go through examples. If you are new, this might be a bit overwhelming, but I hope that the examples help. And this write-up and video is largely based on the Pret Decomp and also Mo's excellent websites. I'm going to have links for both. So the most essential thing to the game is understanding that after you KO an enemy Pokemon, what Pokemon is going to come in next. This logic also applies if an enemy uses U-turn, or a few other cases in mid-turn Switch AI, which we'll look at in the next section. An important thing about Switch AI is that it's universal. It doesn't matter if the enemy trainer has smart AI or no AI, it's always going to work the same. You can understand PostKO Switch AI as two steps. The best Pokemon with a super effective move, and the most damage possible. Both of these steps have a lot of detail and a lot of bugs involved. So let's talk about the best Pokemon with a super effective move. This is the first check and is the simpler one. In this step, the AI will check all its remaining non-fated Pokemon it could switch in. The question is, do they have a super effective move or not? This brings us to the simplest case. Let's say I'm using Garchomp, and I just knocked out a Rapidash. In the back, the enemy has two Pokemon they could switch to, Ambipom 4 and Absol 4. Ambipom obviously has Ice Punch, which is a super effective move against Garchomp. Absol has no super effective move. Because only Ambipom has a super effective move against Garchomp, Ambipom is going to be the Pokemon chosen to switch in. So obviously the next question is, what if multiple Pokemon have a super effective move? Who gets chosen then? Let's expand the previous example to include another Pokemon, which is Latios 1. So once again, Ambipom has Ice Punch, which is super effective, but this time Latios also has a super effective move with Dragon Pulse. So we need to perform the following check. For each of Ambipom and Latios' types, note their type matchup against Garchomp, and then multiply this number by 40. The Pokemon with the highest score wins. An important thing to note here, and a weird part of the Gen 4 Switch AI, is that Ambipom only has one type. It is obviously only normal type. If a Pokemon has only one type, you must pretend its secondary type is the same as its normal type. This is how it's actually coded in the game's code. So let's do this example. Ambipom is obviously neutral against Garchomp with normal type, and it's also neutral against Garchomp with the secondary normal type we assign. Then we do 1 plus 1 is 2, and 2 times 40 is 80. So Ambipom's score against Garchomp is 80. Latios obviously is Dragon Psychic. Dragon has a 2 times super effective multiplier against Garchomp, and Psychic has a neutral type matchup. So we get 2 plus 1 is 3, and then 3 times 40 is 120. And this is Latios' type matchup against Garchomp. So at the end, we check these two numbers, we see that 120 is bigger than 80, and so 120 wins, and Latios is chosen as a switch-in against Garchomp. An important thing to note here is that yes, Ice Punch has a better type effective matchup into Garchomp, it's 4 times super effective, and Dragon Pulse is only 2 times super effective, but this doesn't matter. The AI is simply checking whether or not the Pokemon has any kind of super effective move. And Dragon Pulse and Ice Punch are both scored the same here. Now, Pokemon with a single type are also quite important to consider. Let's look at one where it actually matters. So this is Shelgon 2. Shelgon is obviously only a Dragon type. Since it's a Dragon monotype, both its types are considered to be Dragon. So if Shelgon was a possible switch option here, Shelgon will get 2 times for Dragon versus Dragon Ground, and another 2 times for Dragon versus Dragon Ground. It would then score 4, and then that 4 would be multiplied by 40 to get 160. Because 160 is higher than 120, Shelgon beats Latios in the switch-in AI, and the AI would choose to switch in Shelgon. We can understand this that Latios' Dragon Psychic typing is kind of wasting the super effective type matchup, whereas Shelgon is technically Dragon, and both of those are super effective matchups. This is relatively intuitive. Now the next question is, what if multiple Pokemon have the same type matchup score into Garchomp, and they all have a super effective move? So let's give a new example. This time we could switch into Bagon or Shelgon against Garchomp. Bagon is first in the party order. Both Pokemon obviously have the same super effective move in Dragon Breath, and they have the same type matchup because they're both the Dragon type. So the tiebreaker here is that because Bagon is first in the party order, Bagon will be switched in before Shelgon. So that's the basics of super effective switch-in AI, but there are a few traps here. Let's talk about ability adjustment, which is a really important thing to consider, because Pokemon isn't just about type matchups. So a big one is normalize. Essentially, the AI will correctly account for normalize. If the Pokemon that just fainted has normalize, that doesn't matter for the Pokemon that's about to switch in. And if it's looking at Pokemon switching in, if that Pokemon has normalize and it has a move like Ice Beam is considered to be a normal type move. So it's correctly adjusting for normalize here. Let's also talk about Levitate. This is probably the most famous one. Obviously, your Pokemon can be weak to Earthquake. For example, it could be a Bronzong, but it could also have Levitate, which means it's technically being immune to Earthquake. The AI does understand this. It will cheat to see your exact ability. If you have Levitate, it will know on this step. It'll also correctly check for things which break Levitate. For example, if the attacker has Mold Breaker, it will understand it can hit Levitate. It'll also understand if Gravity or Iron Ball are currently in use, which will also let a Pokemon with Levitate be hit by ground moves. A similar thing happens with Scrappy and Foresight, so if the player is using a Ghost Pokemon like Spiriting, which is Ghost Dark, then a Pokemon with Scrappy in the back and Brick Break or another fighting move will see that it can hit Spiriting for super effective damage with that Brick Break. And finally, Wonder Guard is also correctly considered for the switching calculation. Of course, this doesn't really matter since the check is for super effective moves anyway. But what's important here is that all other abilities are not considered. And as an example of this, let's say I somehow get Volt Absorb onto Lapras, say it's doubles or I have some obscure string of inputs. So I have a Volt Absorb Lapras which is immune to Electric. The AI will not understand that Lapras is immune to Volt Absorb here, and it will happily send in a Thunderbolting enemy, thinking that Thunderbolt can hit Lapras super effectively. In this sense, the Switch AI is a bit flawed. Let's talk about another trap, which is status moves. So say we have the following example of Pokemon we can switch to. Ambipom 1 and Gyarados 4. Again, we're going to be switching into Garchomp. So it might look like most of these Pokemon have no attacks which are super effective against Garchomp. They don't have any kind of Dragon or Ice attacks. However, there is a problem here, which is that Gyarados' Dragon Dance is technically considered a super effective move. Of course, Dragon Dance does no damage, but it's technically Dragon type, and Dragon type is technically super effective against Garchomp. So Gyarados is going to be chosen as a switch in against Garchomp here, simply because it has the move Dragon Dance. Another thing to be really careful about is variable type moves. These are obviously fairly rare, but they are important to account for. So hidden power can easily exist in the back. The AI does understand what the exact hidden power of the Pokemon is. It will not assume that hidden power is normal type. The same adjustments happen for Weather Ball, Judgment, and Natural Gift, and those all get correctly adjusted to be the correct type. Of course, this is quite rare. Probably the most common one you'll see in the game is Weather Ball, but other ROM hacks could easily bring in something else. So that's the basics of switching AI when it comes to the super effective step. But let's talk about two really important bugs that interfere with this. The first one is what we call type check overflow. This is a bug the community is aware of, but let me explain it in full. So again, pretend I have a Garchomp out, and the AI can switch into either Ambipom 4 or Regice 1. Both of these have a super effective ice move against Garchomp. Now, obviously, even without doing any kind of calculation, you should know that Regice's ice type has a better super effective matchup into Garchomp than Ambipom's normal type, and Regice should be switched in. If we do the full maths of this, we do get this. 320 is Regice's score, and 80 is Ambipom's score. So Regice is going to win, and is going to be switched in. However, there is a bug here. This combined type score cannot get a value higher than 255 for programming reasons. This is an overflow error on the type check. This means Regice's true score is not 320, but is 320 mod 256, which is 320 minus 256, which is 64. So Regice's true value against Garchomp is 64. It actually loses to Ambipom. So this scenario, where you have a 4 times super effective matchup on both enemy switch-ins, actually means that it loses out to neutral type matchups. But it could still beat something worse. For example, if we had some kind of electric type, and ground is obviously immune to electric, because that would score 0, Regice would still beat that. So the fact that Regice is overflowing here doesn't mean Regice can never be chosen as the best switch-in candidate, but it does mean that Regice dramatically falls down the chain in terms of what should be switched in next. And I also want you to notice that this is only triggered if both type matchups are times 4. For example, Swampert vs Golem is a very good type matchup as well. This is a 4 times interaction on water and a 2 times interaction on ground. And this scores 6 times 40, which is 240, and this does not overflow. The only way to overflow is to have a times 8 interaction overall. I will also say, this is a common bug. A lot of Pokemon you can use will have 4 times weaknesses, and a lot of Pokemon in the Frontier, or any kind of difficult ROM hack, could easily have coverage for them. So here in the document I also mentioned that the Regice switch-in is not impossible. Again, we got to remember, we're always checking for super effective type matchups. So here, Ambipom and Regice are being considered again. Yes, Ambipom has a better type matchup, but Regice is the only Pokemon here with a super effective move in Ice Beam. So we'll always go to Regice in this scenario. The second bug is much rarer and much more obscure. It's a variant of a famous Gen 3 bug, but this is a pretty recent discovery. So let's bring in a new example for this. Let's say I'm using Gliscor, which is a ground flying type. The opponent is considering sending in Stantler and Regice. Now, on first glance, it looks like Stantler doesn't have any kind of super effective moves, and it looks like Regice does have a super effective move in Ice Beam. So Regice should be chosen here, right? Well, that's not quite how this works. You see, Gliscor is immune to Thunder Wave on its ground typing, but its flying typing is actually weak to Thunder Wave. And this means that Thunder Wave is seen as super effective against Gliscor, even though, obviously, Gliscor is actually immune to it in the real battle. But the switch-in AI does not understand this. The switch-in AI thinks that Gliscor is weak to Electric. So, for example, if there's a Jolteon in here, and Jolteon was the only Pokemon with a super effective move, Jolteon will be switched in instead. So then I mention again here in the document that because Regice has got a 8 times interaction to Gliscor, it overflows just like it did against Garchomp, and Stantler will be chosen to switch in. Stantler has Thunder Wave. Now this bug was rare, and this bug was covered in a video by DRXX. However, the list of Pokemon he provides there are badly wrong. I don't know how he got this wrong, but it is badly wrong. I've mentioned how you can check this in the code yourself. It's the way that AI considers the type ordering in the game's code. Essentially, the thing you need to know is that the only Pokemon affected by this in Gen 4 are Gligar and Gliscor, which are weak to Electric, Aerodactyl, which is weak to Ground, Skarmy, which is weak to Ground, and Girafarig, which is weak to Ghost. As far as I can see, there are no other Pokemon in the game that can trigger this. This can be quite an important bug actually. Gliscor, Aerodactyl, and Skarmy also all benefit from this quite a lot, as they will often be forcing in Pokemon to switch in that don't actually have a super effective move against them. Aerodactyl is probably the weakest one of these, because in the Frontier, if a Pokemon has a ground type attack, it probably has another coverage type attack that can hit Aerodactyl. But Gliscor forcing in electric types and Skarmy forcing in ground types can be really good for you. And I want to make a note here that if you're playing a ROM hack, of course the switch AI can change. I'm saying this for vanilla games and games that do not change the AI, but if you're playing a ROM hack that adds a type like Fairy, then this could easily be very different. And also the ROM hack creator could easily have fixed the bugs mentioned above. So we now move on to the second part of the Switch AI, which is what happens if the AI sees that it has no super effective moves against your Pokemon. Obviously when it has no super effective move, it still wants to pick a good switch in against you. This brings us on to most damage possible. This is the second part of the switch in check. This is a pure damage calculation, but what's really important here is to understand exactly how this works. So let's say I have Garchomp 1 and I just knocked out Gastrodon 2. What the AI is going to do here is take Gastrodon 2, take its exact stats, its exact ability, its exact item, and make Gastrodon 2 use every single move in the enemy party against Garchomp. It is then going to pick the move that does the most possible damage against Garchomp. So let's do a real example of that. Let's say in the back, the AI can either switch to Golduck 1, which has Surf and Psychic as damaging moves, or Venusaur 1, which has Leaf Storm and Sludge Bomb as damaging moves. So if we put these into a damage calculator, and remember, we're putting in these damage calcs for Gastrodon against Garchomp, not for the other Pokemon. So we give Gastrodon Golduck's moves of Surf and Psychic, and Surf comes out as doing 88 max damage. We then do the same for Venusaur. We put in Leaf Storm and Sludge Bomb, and Leaf Storm comes out to do 86 damage. And because 88 is larger than 86, Surf does more damage than Leaf Storm, and Surf wins this check, which means that Golduck is going to be sent out against Garchomp. Golduck is the Pokemon that had the attack that does the most damage against Garchomp when it's used by Gastrodon. Now that is not completely intuitive, and it does take a second for that to sink in, and it does mean if you want to do this precisely, you might have to mess around in the calcs quite a lot. Now despite that sounding simple, there are quite a lot of traps and bugs associated with this part of the switch-in AI as well. Let's first talk about non-standard attacks. So basically, moves that the AI thinks that have variable base power are not included. But this list can be a bit arbitrary. For example, the move Weather Ball technically can change its power. It has variable power depending on the weather. However, Weather Ball is actually correctly included in this damage calc check. But if we think about a move like a Low Kick or Reversal, which also have variable power, these are not included. They will not be part of the calculation used to determine who the best Pokemon to switch into is. The key is that the moves that the AI is going to ignore are moves in the game's code which have a base power of 1. Now you don't need to look these up yourself, I've listed them here. So these are OHKO moves, these always get ignored, Bide always gets ignored, Super Fang always gets ignored. These are quite big because they would often be the best move. Remember the Pokemon obviously has max power flail or reversal if it's just fainted. The move Present gets ignored, Magnitude gets ignored, Endeavour gets ignored, Counter, Mirror Coat, Metal Burst get ignored, Fling, Trump Card and Split Up. And I forgot to add Low Kick and Grass Knot as well, I just realised. I hope this is a full list of moves that get ignored, however I could easily be missing a few. So remember, if a Pokemon has one of these moves, it is not part of the switch in AI. Do not put it in the damage calc. Do not think that the AI is going to factor it in. Now, I said that some moves do have changeable base power, but they still get correctly factored in. And these moves, to give a brief example, Explosion and Self-Destruct, these are big ones, they often win. Eruption and Water Spout get correctly adjusted for as well. Dream Eater, Revenge, Payback and Avalanche, these moves assume that they have the base power, not the double power, but they do get included in the switch AI. Sucker Punch, Weather Ball and Facade. So these moves all get included in the damage calc check. So here's a more obscure bug. Variable type moves in the base game are going to be vulnerable to something called a variable ability type adjustment. That sounds a bit weird, let's have a direct look at an example. Say our switching Pokemon has Hidden Power Fire. Hidden Power Fire is obviously a fire type attack. And let's say it's switching into a Pokemon with Dry Skin or Heat Proof. The Pokemon with that ability is not going to adjust the damage for that Hidden Power Fire check. So that means a Pokemon with Dry Skin is meant to take more damage from a fire type move, but if it's Hidden Power Fire, it will not. The damage calculator almost certainly will not take this into account when considering the switch in AI. The same thing can happen with Sunny Day Weather Ball, or something like Fire type Judgment. Or as we mentioned earlier, potentially something like Natural Gift. Now, these are somewhat rare, obviously talking about things like Dry Skin, Thick Fat and Heat Proof, but they're not unheard of. You could have Pokemon with these and it will affect what the AI chooses to switch in. Also, be really careful of HP dependent abilities like Swarm or Blaze. These will also get factored in. If the Pokemon is just fainted, it is technically in Blaze or Swarm. And remember, the same applies to items. So in our early example, if the Pokemon that just fainted, Gastrodon, had a choice band, it would increase the power of physical moves against Garchomp when considering all the switch-ins. This isn't really a trap that's really important to notice. If the opponent has no moves that can deal damage, and you've got to remember that moves with variable power that we mentioned earlier don't actually deal damage on this check, then the game is just going to send out the next Pokemon in party order. This is another common trap or misconception, which is the fact that the AI checks for a kill. The AI does not care if it kills or not with a move. So let's say I have a Pokemon with 1 HP left and I just knocked out an enemy. The AI could switch to a Pokemon that does 200 damage to me, or it could switch to a Pokemon that does 1 damage to me. It does not care that both kill. It'll go for the Pokemon that does the most damage in this check. Whether or not the move can kill your Pokemon is absolutely irrelevant. Okay, so to no one's surprise, there is a big bug in the damage calc check, which is damage overflow. This is fairly rare in typical gameplay. Basically, to go above 255 damage is quite rare. You probably see this in factory level 100. You also probably see it in a late game ROM hack potentially. Or it could be possible when using a very lopsided Pokemon, or when facing a very lopsided Pokemon. For example, if you're using Blissey, which has naturally low defense. The important part here is that the maximum damage the AI can score is 255. It cannot go higher than this. Of course, in this check, there'll be no super effective damage multiplier, because if the move is super effective, the AI would have already chosen it as a switch in. So let's do an example. Level 100 Rhydon just knocked out level 100 Latios. And let's say the switch in has the move Psychic. So perhaps it's a Pokemon like Alakazam. When Latios tries to use Psychic against Rhydon, Psychic is going to do 268 damage. So if we adjust for 255 being the max score, we get 268 minus 256, which is 12. Obviously 12 damage is horrible. This is a level 100 Pokemon. Probably every other Pokemon on the team has a stronger move than this. So this kind of damage overflow can matter, but we've got to remember that in a real battle, it might not matter. Let's say for example the switch-in Pokemon we're considering has Psychic, but it also has a move like Dark Pulse. Well, Dark Pulse is still going to do a lot of damage to Rhydon. In the example I've listed here, it does 159 damage to Rhydon. 159 is going to score higher than the 12 damage that it thinks Psychic does, and 159 is still probably quite likely to win the switch-in damage check. For example, if the other Pokemon is some kind of physical type, Latios probably doesn't do much damage with a physical move into Rhydon. And so this Dark Pulse might still win, and a Pokemon we expect to come in if there was no bug might still be the Pokemon that comes in anyway. You've got to be really careful with this, that when you see a move that does more than 256 damage, you've got to check that the other moves aren't also very high scoring and aren't better switch options than the other Pokemon on the bench. Now in some rare cases you might see something like this, which for example is Machamp using Double Edge on Blissey. Here the damage from the damage calc will be 711. Now 711 minus 256 is still a number bigger than 255, so we keep subtracting 256 from this number until we get an acceptable number lower than 255. And in here that would be 199. This might seem obvious, but it's just something I want to include to cover all the bases. Now I said that Overflow is quite rare, but there's one case where Overflow isn't that rare, which is Explosion. You've got to remember that Explosion is technically a 500 base power move in Generation 4 because of the halving of the opponent's defense. So even at lower levels, it's quite easy for Explosion to overflow in a damage check. The one insight I'd have here is that for the Frontier, it's quite unlikely to matter. Most explosion Pokemon also have very strong physical moves anyway. So in an example, Fortress 4 might overflow with Explosion, but Double Edge, Earthquake and Rock Slide are quite likely to win the switch-in check anyway. But in the Frontier, particularly playing at level 50, you should probably be expecting the Explosion Pokemon to come in second. Explosion does usually win this step, or it causes Overflow in this step. So let's look at the next bug. This is variable damage carryover. Now this is very rare. Back in Trap 1, I said that non-standard damage moves are ignored. These would be moves like Reversal or Low Kick. However, this is not completely true. When the AI calculates how much damage a move does, it correctly does this for all other moves, and it correctly does this for status moves. It understands that status moves will do 0 damage. However, moves with a power of 1, which are the variable damage moves we mentioned before, are technically skipped. And this means the AI believes that for variable damage moves, the amount of damage they do is actually whatever was just calculated. Now, usually this is fine. Consider Vileplume 2 for example. When the AI is trying to score Vileplume for how much damage it does with its best move, it'll use Toxic. Toxic will deal 0 damage. It'll then use Grass Knot. It skips Grass Knot, and Grass Knot takes the value from Toxic, which is also 0 damage. And then Double Team and Attract all do 0 damage as well. So the AI correctly understands in the switch part of the AI that Vileplume 2 has no attacking moves. It's also fine in most other cases. So let's look at Alakazam 3. Alakazam 3 will have its Psychic scored normally, it'll have Charge Beam scored normally, and it'll have Signal Beam scored normally. Grass Knot is technically skipped, but what that means is that Grass Knot is seen as doing the same amount of damage as Signal Beam. This does not affect the chance of switching in Alakazam 3 at all. Alakazam 3 will obviously just be taking one of these 3 moves as the most damage. If Signal Beam happens to be the best move, it doesn't matter that Grass Knot did the same amount of damage, because doing the same amount of damage does not change the switch in AI at all. But for both Vileplume and Alakazam, you might be wondering, what if Grass Knot was in slot 1? What happens then? And this is the bug. Let's do a real example to show this. I have Garchomp, I'm playing at level 50, and Blastoise just fainted. The AI is considering switching into one of the following Pokemon. So we've got Aggron and Ludicolo. Now, if Blastoise uses Earthquake against Garchomp, it's going to do 37 damage. If Blastoise uses Waterfall against Garchomp, it's going to do 44 damage. So Ludicolo should win best damaging move. This is because Blastoise sees the Waterfall from Ludicolo as having stab damage. So basically, Waterfall has 120 power, which is more than Earthquake's 100, which is why it does more damage against Garchomp here. So the AI should want to switch into Ludicolo. However, it's not going to do this. Aggron's first move is Metal Burst. Metal Burst is a variable damage move. It's going to be skipped. It's going to have to take the value of whatever the AI last calculated in the type switch in AI. Now, it just so happens, the last thing the AI calculated in Switch AI was from the previous step when we were doing super effective checks. It had to calculate the type matchup of Ludicolo against Garchomp. Now, we did this before. The way you do this is that Ludicolo's types are scored against Garchomp. So Ludicolo is Water Grass. Water has a neutral type matchup, it's ×1. Grass has a neutral type matchup, it's ×1. 1 plus 1 is 2. And 2 times 40 is 80. So Ludicolo had an 80 matchup score against Garchomp. Obviously, the AI did not pick Aggron or Ludicolo for the Switch AI for super effective checks. They both don't have a super effective move against Garchomp. However, this value of 80 is still in memory in the AI. And so when the AI tries to calculate Metal Burst against Garchomp, it thinks that Metal Burst is going to do 80 damage against Garchomp, which is Ludicolo's type matchup against Garchomp. Obviously, 80 damage from Metal Burst beats Earthquake and it beats Waterfall. And so the AI is going to choose to switch Aggron in against Garchomp, even though it shouldn't. This is the bug. When it triggers, it has to be the first Pokemon the AI is considering switching to, has to have a variable damage move in slot 1, and the last Pokemon in the party will have to have some kind of non-immune matchup into your Pokemon. If both of those checks pass though, it's quite likely to switch it in. Obviously, Ludicolo had a neutral type matchup against Garchomp, but if we imagine a Pokemon like Lapras, it would have done 120 damage in the hallucination against Garchomp, and it could be even worse. 80 damage is a lot. Unless you get above level 70 to 80, this probably dominates the way that the AI switch-in works. At very high levels, and we're probably specifically talking about level 100, this probably doesn't happen quite so much. So at level 100, Blastoise using Waterfall with Ludicolo probably does score more than 80 against Garchomp, and then Ludicolo would be correctly chosen as a switch-in instead. So I also want to quickly talk about in Frontier the way that the Pokeball icon is displayed in the game. This will not matter if you're playing against an opponent where you know their exact team, but if you don't know their exact team, this can be really important. So let's say I knock out the first Pokemon. The AI has to switch to one of its two options in the back since this is a 3v3 battle. So I'm either going to get an image that looks like this, where the greyed out Pokeball is in the middle, or I'm going to get one that looks like this, where the greyed out Pokeball is on the left. Now here, it means that the AI switched a Pokemon in slot 2 in, and in here, it means the AI switched a Pokemon in slot 3 in. This might seem like a minor detail, but actually this is a fairly important critical part of information. We can say a few things about this once we know that it's slot 2 instead of slot 3. So let me bring in an example. Let's say I have Garchomp out again, and Ambipom 4 switches in. Ambipom 4 is quite likely to switch in against Garchomp because it's got the super effective move. Now, if Ambipom 4 was in slot 3, which is when it looks like this, it means that slot 2 cannot have a Pokemon with a move that is super effective against Garchomp that has an equal or better type matchup against Garchomp than Ambipom does. For example, if slot 2 was another normal type with an ice move, that would be impossible. The AI would have chosen to go to that Pokemon first. It also means that slot 2, for example, could not be a water type with an ice beam as well, as water also has a neutral type matchup against Garchomp, and Ambipom would then win the switch in. Now, however, if Ambipom 4 was in slot 2 when it came out, which looks like this is not true. The Pokemon in slot 3 might be a water type, it might be a normal type, and so on. We don't know, because Ambipom will win the switch-in decision against Garchomp based on the party order then. So we can also take this a bit further. Let's say Miltank 4 switches in. Once Miltank 4 switches in, I know a few things for certain. I know that the other Pokemon that the AI could have switched to does not have a super effective move against Garchomp. I also know that the AI does not have a Pokemon that does more damage against Garchomp than one of Miltank's moves used by the Pokemon that just fainted. However, once again, we can say a bit more than this. If Miltank is in slot 2, then the Pokemon in slot 3 might have a move that ties strongest damage. For example, it might also have the move Giga Impact. But if Miltank is in slot 3, then we know that slot 2 has lost against Miltank. It has not tied Miltank for strongest move. Now, of course, in the Frontier, we often deal with incomplete information. We won't know exactly what the Pokemon's going to be. So let's do an example. Let's say the AI sends in Regirock second against Garchomp. So these are the Regirock sets. If you're not a Frontier player, don't worry about this. We can say a few things here because of the Switch AI. First up, the most likely Regirock to switch into Garchomp would be Regirock 2. This is because Regirock 2 is the only Regirock with a super effective move against Garchomp with Ice Punch. Regirock 2 is therefore most likely, and if Regirock 2 does come in, then the other Pokemon in the back might also have a super effective move against Garchomp. However, because Regirock is obviously a rock type, and rock is not very effective against ground, the last Pokemon, if it does have a super effective move, cannot have a better type matchup into Garchomp than Regirock does. And this is quite important information, because it means, for example, the last Pokemon couldn't be a Golduck with Ice Beam, as Golduck with Ice Beam would have been switched in first. Now, if it's not Regirock 2, the next most likely Regirock to switch in is actually Regirock 4. Why is this? Once again, we covered it before. It's because of Explosion, and it's because of the other strong damaging moves. Regirock 4 is just more likely to be picked in as a switch-in compared to the other Regirocks. However, it's not a lot more likely. Regirock 1 and Regirock 3 still have strong moves. They still have Hammer Arm and Earthquake respectively. These moves are quite likely to tie or beat a number of the other sets in the Frontier, so you wouldn't be surprised to see Regirock 1 or Regirock 3 come in. However, if Regirock 1, 3 or 4 come in, we now know a little bit more. We know that the Pokemon in the back cannot have a super effective move against Garchomp, which is quite big information, particularly if you're playing Factory. And we also know the Pokemon in the back must have lost the strongest damaging move against Garchomp over Regirock. It has a weaker move against Garchomp than Regirock does. And this brings us to a fundamental truth of how to play the Factory, which is that after you knock a Pokemon out in the Factory, by default, you're probably going to switch. The AI probably switched in a Pokemon that has a good move against you and a good type matchup, or has a powerful move against you. Quite often in the Factory, you want to switch out. This is quite a big difference from Gen 4 Factory compared to Gen 3 Factory, because in Gen 3 the Switch AI does not operate like this at all, and the way it picks the best type against you is actually backwards. So let's do another example that is a bit more illuminating. Let's do Medicham switching in against Garchomp. Now, if Medicham switches in against Garchomp, the most likely Medicham set would be Medicham 4. Again, if it's not Medicham 4, we know that the last Pokemon cannot have a super effective move against Garchomp. But we actually get even more information from Medicham. Because Medicham 3 is a special set, we're probably going to know a bit more about the Pokemon in the back being either special or physical based on the fact that Medicham 3 has a different move category, which is special, than Medicham 1 and Medicham 2. On top of this, Medicham 2 does not have a very strong move against Garchomp. If Medicham 2 comes in, we probably get quite a lot of information about what the last Pokemon possibly could be. It has to have a move that's weaker than Drain Punch. Medicham 1 is a bit different. Zen Headbutt does quite good damage against Garchomp, but it still gives us a bit of information. For example, we would then know that the last Pokemon can't have the move Earthquake, as Earthquake does more damage to Garchomp than Zen Headbutt does. There's also a very extreme example which could be Werelord 2. What if Werelord 2 comes out against Garchomp second out? Because Werelord 2 did not trigger super effective AI, and Werelord 2's strongest move is Whirlpool, which only has 15 power, the list of Pokemon that could be in the back is now tiny. Whirlpool is obviously an incredibly weak attack, and it's a good chance that the final Pokemon has no actual attacking moves. It's quite likely the final Pokemon could be something like Milotic 2. Again, if you're a factory player, you want to be thinking about this kind of stuff a lot. Obviously, the general truth here is if the Pokemon in slot 3 was sent out, and it doesn't have a terrible type matchup against you, the second Pokemon out probably doesn't have a super effective move. You want to be careful about assuming this always, but it is quite often true in the way that the game operates. It also depends a lot on your Pokemon that just knocked them out. If you've read my Gen 4 factory guide, you'll be familiar that in factory I often recommend leading off with a Pokemon which has very few weaknesses or a lot of weaknesses, because this triggers the switch AI a lot more often or a lot more rarely, and this also gives you much more information on average. And that's part of why electric types, for example, are often quite good leads in the factory. Now obviously if you're in the frontier and you're playing factory or tower, you also get more information from the type hint or from knowing the exact trainer's roster of possible Pokemon. You can combine this with the Pokeball sent out and team knowledge, and often get quite a lot of information. It is not rare to be able to narrow down the last possible Pokemon to only 2 or 3 possibilities, or in some rare cases, you might know the exact last Pokemon before you've even seen it come out. So let's do a full recap on PostKO Switch AI. The following is the exact sequence of how it works. Calculate the type matchup score of every single Pokemon the AI could send in against you. If it's a monotype Pokemon, pretend its secondary type is also its primary type. Multiply this type matchup score by 40. If this number is greater than 255, take 256 away from the number. Now starting with the Pokemon with the highest score in step 1, check if it has any super effective move against the player's Pokemon. This includes all status moves. It also includes moves in the super effective immunity bug checklist. This was back when we talked about how Gliscor is seen as weak to Thunderbolt. If a Pokemon with a super effective move is found, switch to it immediately. And if multiple Pokemon tie on the best type matchup score, and they all have super effective moves, the one first in the party order is going to win. So if step 2 didn't result in any kind of switch, which means no Pokemon has a super effective move, then calculate the damage for each switch candidate you could do into the player's Pokemon with all of their moves, as if the move was just used by the Pokemon which just fainted. If a move does more than 255 damage, subtract 256 from that damage until it is 255 or lower, and then this is to be considered the damage for that move. If the first move of the first Pokemon being considered is a variable power move, set the damage of this move equal to the final Pokemon type matchup score from step 1. And then outside of this, ignore all of the variable power moves in terms of damage. Then in step 4, find a Pokemon that has the most damage dealt in step 3 and switch to it. If multiple Pokemon tie for the strongest move, then the tiebreaker is party order again. The first Pokemon with the strongest move gets to be switched in. If no Pokemon has a super effective move, which is a step 2 failure, and no Pokemon has any move that does damage, which is a step 4 failure, send out the first Pokemon in party order. So that's a lot, but what does that actually mean in plain English? I would say the Gen 4 Switch AI actually makes a lot of sense. It tries to pick a Pokemon strong into you with a super effective move. If it can't do that, it tries to pick a Pokemon that probably does the most damage against you. Of course, this isn't always exactly what happens, and we should be very careful with the most damage, that there is a bias for the AI to switch in a Pokemon that has the same type as a Pokemon that just fainted, since the Pokemon that just fainted is going to use its moves with stab still applied. And there's also a bias to switch in the Pokemon with the same category as a Pokemon that just fainted. For example, if a physical attacker just fainted, it's a bit more likely the physical attacker is going to switch in. And it's also a bit more likely that if your Pokemon is very weak to either physical or special moves, the AI is a bit more likely to send in a physical or special attacker respectively. However, when I say likely, of course all this can be calculated in terms of exact damage calculations. In terms of the bugs, the most important bug to be aware of is the Overflow type check bug in the first stage of the AI, and then later, at very high levels, you also want to be aware of the Overflow bug in terms of the damage AI as well. The other bugs are somewhat rare, but they can spring up if you're going for a very big streak in the frontier, or if you're trying to beat a very difficult ROM hack. These are likely going to be things that you are tested on. Okay, so let's now talk about mid-turn Switch AI. Mid-turn Switch AI is when the AI switches to another Pokemon while its current Pokemon is still alive. This would be an unexpected switch in terms of casual play. Mid-turn switch AI is very different to post-KO AI. It's also something that's really important to be aware of, as it's the most human-like the AI can behave. If you're caught unaware by switch AI, it can easily lead to a loss. Now the mid-turn switch AI is one big algorithm, and we're going to go over it in the same order as the code does. So the first thing to be aware of is that switch AI does not care about move AI. Let's say I'm in some kind of scenario. Let's say I've got a Shuckle at 1 HP against a Jolteon, and Jolteon has a really powerful move, and it's always going to kill me. Obviously, a human would stay in with Jolteon and attack Shuckle, but it doesn't matter for mid-turn switch AI. If mid-turn switch AI wants to switch, the move AI does not matter. Mid-turn switch AI is going to overrule it, and the game is going to switch instead of attack. So it doesn't matter how logical it would be to stay in and use the move, the mid-turn switch AI runs independently. The next thing it does is check whether or not switching would be illegal. This check isn't particularly clever though, so let's look at what the AI does. If the AI is trapped by a move like Sand Tomb or Bind, the AI is never going to switch. If the AI has used Ingrain, the AI will also never switch. If you have the ability Shadow Tag, the AI is never going to switch. If you have the ability Arena Trap, the AI is never going to switch. And if any other Pokemon on the field, including the AI's ally Pokemon, has Magnet Pull, and the Pokemon is a Steel type, the AI will never try and switch that Steel type. So obviously there's a few bugs here and a few huge gaps. The first one is that the AI does not factor whether or not it's a flying or levitating Pokemon against Arena Trap. That means if you have an Arena Trap Dugtrio and you're facing an Aerodactyl, Aerodactyl is going to think it's Arena Trapped and it can't switch out. The AI also doesn't factor in the fact that if you have Shadow Tag and it also has Shadow Tag, then Shadow Tag isn't actually trapping that Pokemon anymore. It doesn't run this check. The AI also doesn't factor in that it can never trap its teammate with Magnet Pull. It should only be enemies that can be trapped with Magnet Pull. And the AI also doesn't understand that the item Shed Shell always lets it switch. And then one other bonus one, the AI has to have a valid Pokemon to switch to in order to be able to switch. Okay, so let's talk about Perichon. This is the most predictable way to see the AI switch. If the AI's Perichon count is 1, it's always going to switch. There's no randomness involved here. Once the switch is triggered, it's going to run the post-KO switch AI to decide what to switch to. Now because of this, Perichon AI is one of the easiest ways to abuse a free attack against the enemy. Let's say the enemy starts off with a completely innocent Pokemon that does no damage. If you Perichon against it and then switch out, the Pokemon you switch out to is guaranteed to get a free hit on a Pokemon the AI will have to switch in against it with post-KO switch AI. Okay, let's talk about Wonder Guard. So Wonder Guard has a very strange check. This is specifically a check for if the player is using Wonder Guard, of course. So first up, the AI will never switch against Wonder Guard if this is a doubles match. Next, the AI checks its currently active Pokemon. Does it have a move that hits the player's Wonder Guard Pokemon super effectively? Any kind of variable type move will use its correct typing here. That includes things like Hidden Power. If the AI does not have an attack that hits Wonder Guard, search the party for non-fainted Pokemon. And then we search for moves that can hit Wonder Guard super effectively. Again, variable type moves will use the correct type here. And then each time the AI finds a move that hits Wonder Guard super effectively, it has a 2/3 chance to switch to it. It will repeat this check until there are no Pokemon left to check. So that means if the enemy team has a Pokemon with 2 super effective moves against Wonder Guard, it would have an 8/9 chance to switch to it, because both of the moves trigger the 2/3 chance. Now, if the switch activates on any of these checks, the AI is guaranteed to switch to that Pokemon with that move. It will not run regular post-KO switch AI. Crucially though, the AI is never guaranteed to switch out against Wonder Guard, and this makes this somewhat unreliable. You cannot know exactly when it's going to switch out, it's just very likely to switch out if it is possible. The next part of switch AI is mid-turn switch AI is no damaging moves. This sounds like a rather simple check, but it's actually quite complicated. First, the AI checks if it can hit any of your Pokemon with a damaging move. In doubles, this includes both of your Pokemon. It detects damage based on the same immunity check. Remember, this immunity check is more than just a type check. It does include Normalize, Levitate, things that affect Levitate, Scrappy, and so on. It does not include a PP check though. Moves that are out of PP are still seen as being able to do damage. If any move deals damage, it won't switch in this section. It also won't switch if it only has 0 or 1 attacking moves. Otherwise, meaning it has 2 or more damaging moves, and none of those moves deal damage, it looks for the entire party for non-fainted Pokemon. Every single time you find a move on that Pokemon, if that move is super effective, it has a 2/3 chance to switch to that Pokemon. This stacks with every single move that the Pokemon has. If step 1 did not cause a switch, loop through the entire team again and look through all their moves again. If the move does neutral damage against the player, there's a 50% chance to switch to it. Obviously again, if switching is chosen, we always switch to the Pokemon that triggered the switch. We do not run regular post-KO switch AI. So next up is Ability Absorbing. This is a bit of a strange but logical check. I'm going to go through this one a bit faster. First up, the AI is unlikely to switch if it has a super effective move. It stops 2/3 of the time. Then we next check if the AI has been hit by a damaging move in the last turn. We also check the type of that damaging move that was just used. If the damaging move was fire, water, or electric, we set the ability to check to be flash fire, water absorb, or volt absorb respectively. So basically, this ability absorbing check is entirely about fire, water, electric, flash fire, water absorb, volt absorb, and it must be a damaging move. Now, if the current Pokemon out has the correct ability, for example, if the player just used a fire attack and the AI has a flash fire Pokemon, it won't switch. This might sound like a useless check, but it's actually not, because the player could easily have Mold Breaker. Or otherwise, if all these checks pass, the AI looks for its team to find a Pokemon with a viable switch that has the correct absorb ability into your last attack. So, for example, we just use Thunderbolt against the enemy. The enemy has a Jolteon in the back. It has a 50% chance to switch to Jolteon because Jolteon has the ability Volt Absorb. So next up is Natural Cure. You'll be careful about this one. Natural Cure is really just a sleep check. So the AI is never going to trigger this switch unless it has Natural Cure and it is asleep specifically. No other status triggers this, and it has more than 50% HP remaining. It then runs a separate check if the last move was non-damaging. There's a 50% chance to trigger PostKO switch AI. Next, if the last move was damaging, we run the immune and switch procedures, which I'm about to talk about in a second. And for the immune and switch resist, there's a 50% chance to run on the Pokemon found. And finally, if all of that fails, it still has a 50% chance to switch anyway, triggering regular PostKO switch AI. So basically, if a Pokemon with Natural Cure is asleep and at high HP, it's very likely to switch. There's a brief interlude here, which is that the AI in mid-turn switch now runs a very specific check. It tries to see if it has a super effective move against the player. Every time it sees a move that's super effective against a player, there's a 90% chance to stop. Now stop here means that we can't switch anymore. Nothing beyond this in a document is going to cause a switch. And this stacks for every attack. So if it has multiple super effective moves, it has multiple chances to trigger a 90% stop. But critically, this is not 100% reliable, which means even if the AI has a super effective move against you, it can still switch out if later checks are met. Next, the AI counts all the positive stat boosts it has. If these add up to 4 or more, the AI is never going to switch. This is a really important one to remember. It means that, for example, if the AI is boosted to +3 attack, +2 speed, and even if it has -6 defense and -6 special defense, it will still never switch, because the positive stat boosts of +3 and +2 add up to +5, which is higher than 4. So an opponent with a lot of stat boosts will never trigger switches past this in the document. So next up is what's called immune switching. For this check to run, the AI must have been hit by a move, that move must be attacking, and it must have acted first in the last turn. In other words, the player acted second. It does not have to be faster than the player for this to trigger. For example, if the AI uses Quick Attack and then you use Flamethrower, obviously you acted second even if your Pokemon was faster. It can also trigger if the player uses a move like Counter or Mirror Coat or Avalanche, which has decreased priority. It has to be an attack, so if it's a status move, this stops. We then search the party for Pokemon which is immune to the last attack used against the AI. This includes all the previous checks identifying Normalize, Mold Breaker, Levitate, Wonder Guard, and so on. But it does not include abilities like a Volt Absorb. So, as an example, the player just used the move Earthquake and went second, and in the back the AI has a Pokemon like Xatu, which is immune to Earthquake. Now for any Pokemon we find in the back which has an immunity to that move, we find moves that are super effective against the player. For each move found, there's a 50% chance to swap to that Pokemon. So again, let's say we have Xatu in the back, I've used Earthquake, and Xatu has a move that's super effective against me. Let's say it has Drill Peck. There's a 50% chance it can switch to Xatu right then and there. And this super effective check also correctly checks the right abilities in the same way as above. Now, as with many cases with the Switch AI, because this is per move, it stacks. So let's say the AI has a Swampert in the back, and I've just used Thunderbolt. Let's say Swampert has Earthquake and Mudshot. Because Earthquake and Mudshot are both super effective against me, there's a 50% chance it runs checks for both of them, and a 75% chance to switch to Swampert overall. This check repeats for every Pokemon in the enemy party which is immune to the move the player just used, and of course it has to have a super effective move against that Pokemon. We then move on to the resist switch. This is exactly the same as the immune switch, except instead of checking for a Pokemon that is immune to the move that you just used, it checks for a Pokemon that resists the move that you last used. And every time it finds a super effective move, there's a 1/3 chance to switch instead of a 50% chance to switch. Resist switches are of course a lot more likely to happen. Whenever you use an attacking move when you're slower, it's quite likely there is a Pokemon on the enemy team that has a resist switch into that, particularly in 6v6 singles. Now, as I said in the natural cure section, the natural cure checks run resist and immune switches, and the chance to switch per move is 50% instead. Okay, so in plain English, what can we learn about mid-turn switch AI? I would say mid-turn switch AI in general works quite well. Its checks aren't perfect, but it does correctly understand typing, and it does correctly apply abilities such as Mold Breaker and Levitate. However, so long as you go first in a turn, switching is actually very rare. You're very unlikely to have a Pokemon with the ability Wonder Guard. Peristrong is obviously very rare. Players don't use Peristrong very often, and the enemy sets with Peristrong are not very deadly at all. And against a strong opponent, the no damaging moves check passing is rare. In the Frontier, most Pokemon have quite good type coverage. And also in the main game, you'll quite like to face an enemy trainer with decent type coverage. Being able to do no damage at all is quite rare. It would probably be exclusive to a Pokemon with only ground moves, for example. I would also say the natural cure sleep switch option is quite rare as well. It probably only happens when an enemy Pokemon with natural cure uses rest. The one that comes to mind in the Frontier, of course, is Altaria. So this leaves one major way the AI can switch mid-turn, which is the immunity and resist switching. You can avoid this simply by being faster or by not attacking until you're ready to attack. Generally, of course, it's important to go first as much as possible anyway, just like it's generally advised to kill enemies as fast as possible anyway. When a player does use a slower Pokemon, typically these are stall and setup Pokemon, and you aren't likely to be attacking them for quite a while, which means you can't trigger the immune or resist switch anyway. I will say it's a bit of a shame that Pokemon already punishes players for using slow offensive Pokemon like Rhydon, but mid-turn switch AI just gives you another reason to avoid them. But, and this is probably the most important point, sometimes going second is unavoidable. Fast enemies do exist. You could be facing a Jolteon or an Aerodactyl. In these scenarios, it's very important to get into the habit of clicking different moves when possible. So, for example, if you're facing a fast enemy Pokemon and you have two moves, both moves will 2-hit KO the enemy, you want to use a different move on the second turn. That way you're going to catch an immune or resist switch trying to switch into your first move. This is a small but worthwhile habit to develop. I also want to say, remember that the immune AI does not check for abilities like Volt Absorb. That is run separately earlier on. I also want to say there are holes in the Switch AI. You might realise that earlier we didn't mention Dry Skin against water moves. The AI does not consider this in ability immunity and also does not consider this in regular immunity. So you are not going to force in a Dry Skin Pokemon by using a water type move. Now it is possible to abuse the Switch AI in other ways, but it can be quite difficult. Now abusing the Switch AI is possible, but the randomness makes it hard. Let's say I'm facing the following team, of Hippowdon 2 and Togekiss 3. I could bring Mantine to this battle. Mantine has Surf and Ice Beam. Normally when Hippowdon is out, we'd want to use Surf against it, as Surf does the most damage. However, we check this and we realise that Earthquake and Sand Tomb are both attacks which do not do any damage at all against Mantine. This triggers no damaging moves in the Switch AI, and so the Switch AI is able to randomly switch to Togekiss on every turn. Because the AI is quite likely to switch to Togekiss, and Togekiss has two neutral moves against Mantine, it's about 75% chance to switch Togekiss in, and we might want to use Ice Beam or Confuse Ray instead of Surf, half protecting Togekiss to come in each turn. Now this sounds very clever, where we're trying to predict Togekiss coming in, and we want to use a move that's better against Togekiss than it is against Hippowdon. However, we want to be careful about not being too clever here. Obviously, Hippowdon might stay in. A 25% chance to stay in is quite real. If it does stay in, it's either going to use Swagger or Yawn. Both of these moves can be problems for Mantine. So even though Hippowdon is quite likely to be switched out, we might want to use Surf anyway, just hedging on the idea that it might be staying in. Okay, so to understand the rest of this guide, you're going to have a bit of a basic idea about how move AI selection works. So let's start off with a quick example. I have the Pokemon Gengar 1, and I'm facing an enemy with the Pokemon Gastrodon 1. The way this works with Smart AI is that each of Gastrodon's moves gets a score. Let's see what that looks like. First up, Waterfall gets a score of +0, this is no change. Earthquake gets a score of -13. Recover gets a score of -11. And Countercoat could get a score of +0. I explain why these scores happen here. It's to do with how basic and Smart AI work. You can also find AI procedures for all moves on Mo's website. The way this works though is that after scoring each move, the AI is going to pick a move with the highest score. Obviously in the table above, there are two moves that scored highest. Waterfall and Countercoat both got +0. Since they both scored +0, it's going to randomly pick between one of those moves. Now, an important thing to understand about the AI is it is not deterministic. We could repeat the same example. This time, Countercoat gets a +4 score. This is also possible, and simply due to the fact that Smart AI might give Countercoat a +4 score against Gengar. Of course, if Coat does get a +4 score, it will beat Waterfall at +0, and Coat is going to be used against Gengar. Because both of these scenarios are somewhat likely, and because the chance of getting a +4 score in the Smart AI is around 50%, we can say that overall, the chance that Gastrodon uses Coat on turn 1 is about a 75% chance, and the chance it uses Waterfall on turn 1 is about a 25% chance. This is obviously a very powerful conclusion. It might mean that we don't want to use Shadow Ball against Gastrodon, as Coat is quite likely, and instead of going for Shadow Ball, we could instead go for Confuse Ray. Indeed, Confuse Ray would be a much better idea here. Of course, if Smart AI is not active for this trainer, Coat could never get +4, and so it would be 50-50 to Coat or Waterfall, and it then might be a bit harder to know what move to use. If the basic AI flag is also not active for this trainer, then Gastrodon is simply going to be at +0 on every move, and it's going to randomly pick one of its 4 moves. Let's do another example to try and hit this home. I have Gengar 1 out again, and this time I'm facing Aerodactyl 2. Here, Aerodactyl is going to score +0 on Bite. The strongest move of the AI is often going to score +0. The moves Fire Fang, Thunder Fang, and Ice Fang all score -1 against Gengar, and they do this because they see that Bite does more damage than them. The way we rationalize this is that the AI likes to deprioritize using attacks that don't do as much damage as one of its other attacks. This is generally true, but we need to be really careful about the exceptions, and we will talk about the exceptions in the later part of this guide. Some moves like Explosion are ignored in this step. This means that if the AI's best move is Explosion, its next strongest attack after Explosion will not get -1 in the AI here. I will also say that if 2 or more moves do the exact same damage against Gengar with their max damage roll, then all those moves will be left at +0. None of them are going to be deprioritized as being weaker than anything else. Now, for the rest of this guide, I'm going to assume that Basic and Smart AI are both active. This is usually true for the Frontier outside of the very early game. It's also usually true for ROM hacks and very difficult boss fights. Something really important to be aware of is that in-game fights might have additional flags like Risky AI. These do not exist in the Frontier, but they can easily exist in various different ROM hacks. If these flags are active, you're also going to have to account for them. They're also going to change the way that the AI scores moves. However, the fundamental logic of how this guide is still going to apply. So I'm going to do a quick run through of some important AI notes and bugs. These are things that newer players quite often get wrong. So first, as I said before, the mid-turn switch AI always runs before and prioritizes over move AI. The second thing is that the AI almost never cares about how much damage the player can deal to it. This might be slightly counterintuitive. For example, perhaps you easily two-shot the enemy with a move like Surf, and this would mean that it's pointless to use a move like Iron Defense. The AI is still going to probably use Iron Defense in this scenario though. As humans, we know that would be a huge mistake, but this is just how the AI operates. It's more a set of algorithms than any kind of true intelligence. Next up, the AI will almost always cheat to see your exact item. For example, if you have a Choice Scarf, it will know that it is slower than you. The AI also cheats to see your exact stats, your defense, special defense, HP, attack and everything, and will cheat to see your current HP as well. This is never information that is hidden from the AI. Even though, of course, in regular gameplay, your Infernape might have a lot of defense EVs or might not have a lot of defense EVs, and a regular human wouldn't know before facing you. Next up is that the AI does not know any of your moves until you use them. This can matter in a few scenarios where the AI quite often looks up if you have a move like Protect before it uses Sky Attack. The next one is a big one. The AI almost never knows what your exact ability is. The AI is going to assume that you have a regular ability for that Pokemon. So for example, if you have a Jolteon, it's going to assume that it has Volt Absorb because the only legal ability on Jolteon is Volt Absorb. The AI will only change this information once it sees text being printed out. For example, if it tries to use Earthquake on Bronzong and it sees text like Levitate makes ground moves miss, it will now know that Bronzong has Levitate. However, if you switch out Bronzong, it will immediately forget that Bronzong has Levitate, even if you switch it back in the same fight. For Pokemon that could have multiple abilities, for example, Bronzong could have Levitate or it could have Heat Proof, every single time it runs a check, it's going to randomly guess whether or not you have Levitate. As another example, against Honchkrow, Honchkrow can have Super Luck or Insomnia. Half the time it's going to guess you have Insomnia, and half the time it's going to guess you don't have Insomnia, and then it could use a move like Hypnosis. There are a few very rare cases where the AI will cheat to see your exact ability before it knows it. These are usually for damage altering abilities like Solid Rock, or for trapping abilities like Shadow Tag. Next one is, unlike in Generation 3, the AI does not foresee when a Quick Claw is going to be activated in a turn. It also cannot know who's about to win any kind of speed tie. However, if a Pokemon does have Quick Claw, the AI is going to assume that 20% of the time that Pokemon is going to move first, and that could change the behavior of procedures in the AI that care about who is going to move first in terms of speed. Next up, the AI always knows its exact stats, moves, items, ability, and the stats, move, items, and abilities of any of its allies, even if you are the ally in a tag battle. The AI is never going to be in the dark about this. Next up, and this is a big misconception, the AI does not care about accuracy at all. Let's say, for example, that it could use Zap Cannon or it could use Aerial Ace. If both of these moves score +0, it will randomly pick between both moves. It doesn't care that obviously Zap Cannon has a much higher chance to miss than Aerial Ace does. You also want to be really careful around AI effectiveness checks. I won't go into this in detail in the video, but in the guide you can read more about this. Basically, things like adaptability and tinted lens and solid rock can change how these interactions work. There are also a few cases where the AI is going to refuse to use a move, and these are mostly to make sure it's acting legally. For example, it cannot use a move once that move is out of PP. It also can't use a different move if it is choice locked itself into a different move. And it can't use a move where it is unselectable because of Torment or Disable, or a move like Taunt, or a move like Encore. But, and this is really important to understand, even if a move is impossible to select, it will still be assumed as valid in other checks. For example, let's say a choice banned Pokemon is locked into Earthquake and I have a Staraptor out. Staraptor is immune to Earthquake, and that choice banned Pokemon cannot touch Staraptor at all. However, the AI does not understand this. If the AI sees that it also has Rock Slide, it'll think, oh, I can just use Rock Slide against the Staraptor, and it won't trigger any other different parts of the AI. Finally, there's also another note here that the immune super effective bug mentioned earlier in the Switch AI section also applies to various super effective checks. So quite often it'll think that Thunder Wave, for example, is super effective against Gliscor. However, this is not completely consistent, and I recommend checking Mo's website to be completely sure about interactions around this. Okay, so we just talked a lot about the AI and talked a lot about how unpredictable it can be. So the real question that Nuzlockers want to answer, and a lot of Frontiers want to know the answer to as well, is when is the AI going to be predictable? The absolute top one, and the most common example, is what's called kill AI. This is the main source of predictability from the AI. And this is, in Generation 4, if the AI's maximum damage roll on a move can kill your Pokemon, that move is going to get a +4 score in kill AI. +4 score is usually enough to win highest scoring move and be chosen by the AI. This can then lead to a lot of strategy. For example, if we know that Earthquake is going to KO our Heatran, then we can simply swap out to a flying Pokemon, being safe in the knowledge that the enemy AI is about to use Earthquake. A question then becomes, what if multiple moves all kill your Pokemon? Let's say I have a Metapod with 1 HP remaining. Obviously, every single attack in the game is going to kill Metapod. So any attack that the enemy AI has is all going to get a +4 score, so long as it's a move that considers itself to be a move that can kill under kill AI, which is most damaging attacks. And of course, if all these moves are going to score a +4 in the kill AI, they're all going to be randomly chosen against. So for example, Flamethrower scores a +4 against Metapod, and so does Tackle. This means that we don't know for certain whether or not it's going to use Flamethrower or Tackle when it tries to kill Metapod. Now, there are quite a lot of quirks, bugs, and exceptions to the way that the kill AI works in Gen 4. Let's go over a few big points to make quickly. First up, the AI never assumes or checks whether or not it's going to get a critical hit against the player. Next up, the AI never includes any kind of random damage variance, which is a roll or a range commonly referred to. Of course, the Gen 3 AI does include this, but the Gen 4 AI does not. This is a big one. If you have a super effective damage reduction berry, like a Yachi berry, the AI does not see this as reducing damage. So if Ice Beam does 150% damage to Garchomp without Yachi Berry, and it does 75% with the Yachi Berry included, the AI is going to think that it does 150%. Focus Sash, meaning that Pokemon survive moves, is completely ignored. Another big one is Priority Kill AI. So these moves get +6 and not +4. For example, Extreme Speed, Aqua Jet, Quick Attack. These moves get used instead of regular kill moves if both kill. Another big one to understand if the move has other AI running on it. For example, the AI likes using Icy Wind based on who is faster. This is included in the scoring. This means that if the AI is slower and Icy Wind kills, it might score +6 instead of +4. But if the AI is faster than the player and Icy Wind kills, it might only score +1 instead of +4. This is a big bug. The AI does not see the Life Orb damage boost. So if a Life Orb attack is meant to do 120% damage with Life Orb included, and 92% without Life Orb included, the AI is going to think that the attack does 92%. It does not see the Life Orb damage boost. It also does not see the damage from the item Metronome boosting the damage. The AI also cheats to see the abilities you have that alter the damage output here. For example, if you have Heatproof, Dry Skin, or Thick Fat, The AI will cheat to see that they do more or less damage respectively. Next up, unless otherwise stated, the AI does correctly handle most other damage multipliers. So things like stab boosting, choice specs, magnet, reflect, blaze, huge power, etc. These all work and do get correctly accounted for in the AI. The AI will also correctly calculate the damage of moves like Seismic Toss and Dragon Rage. Now, as we said earlier, a lot of moves could have their power boosted under certain circumstances. The AI in general does not understand how this increased damage applies. This matters a lot for kill AI and when the AI tries to understand what moves are the strongest. In particular, multi-hit moves, so for example something like Double Slap, are only assumed to hit once in terms of the kill AI and the highest damage AI. Moves like Payback, Avalanche and Revenge are all assumed to use their regular base power and never double in power, even if the AI sees that it is slower. The Reckless and Recall damage boost is not calculated correctly. Facade and Status is also not doubled correctly in damage. There's also a lot of moves that double power based on a particular scenario happening, such as using Brine versus a low HP target, or using Wake Up Slap on an opponent that is sleeping, or using Earthquake or Magnitude against a target that is underground. The AI never understands to double the damage in these scenarios. Future Sight and Doom Desire do not correctly use typos damage in Gen 4, but instead the AI thinks that they use stab and effectiveness like normal attacks. Psywave uses random damage. Consecutive hit power moves like Rollout or Fury Cutter are not getting their damage boosts increased. And finally, Weatherball is very broken in the damaging AI. It does not understand how to adjust type adjustment on a damage step specifically, although the other checks do understand its typing. This makes Weatherball extremely weird and extremely random. So next, and most importantly, some moves are not included in kill AI damage calculations. None of these moves ever get +4, even if they result in a guaranteed kill on the player. They also never adjust the priority of regular damaging moves on that set. So for example, if a set has Explosion and Earthquake, Earthquake will never get a -1 score for being weaker than Explosion. You'll find a full list of the moves here. There are a few big ones I want to point out for the video. So Flail and Reversal are ignored for kill AI. Fling is ignored for kill AI. Self-Destruct and Explosion aren't included. Dream Eater is included. Hyperbeam and Hyperbeam-like moves are not included. Solar Beam is not included. Focus Punch is not included, and Superpower is not included. So if you got this far, you'll probably have a good basic understanding of how the AI operates. It's time to talk about doubles. Doubles is obviously quite a lot more complicated than singles. So let's start off with a continuation of an earlier example. Let's say I have two Pokemon, Gengar 1 and Gardevoir 1, and I'm facing an enemy with Gastrodon 1. For simplicity, we're just going to say that Gardevoir is synchronized and both of my Pokemon are at full HP. So here's the question, what is the AI going to do with Gastrodon here? The basic way doubles works is actually quite simple. Gastrodon has both of its moves scored against both Gengar and Gardevoir. We saw that earlier. Its highest scoring moves against Gengar are Waterfall and Mirror Coat, and against Gardevoir its strongest scoring moves are Earthquake and Mirror Coat. The doubles AI then does what the singles AI does. It has to pick one of the moves with the highest score. So in this example, it's either randomly going to choose Waterfall or Mirror Coat against Gengar, and it's going to randomly choose Earthquake or Mirror Coat against Gardevoir. Up until now, everything is the same as singles except we've considered both targets. Now that we've chosen Waterfall against Gengar, and Mirror Coat against Gardevoir as the strongest moves, and they both score +0, what Gastrodon is then going to do is pick the move that has the best overall score considering both targets. Since both targets are stuck at +0, it's obviously randomly going to choose between using Waterfall on Gengar or using Mirror Coat on Gardevoir. Now because the AI is non-deterministic, this could have easily come out in a different way. For example, let's say Mirror Coat scored +4 against Gengar. Well, now it sees that Mirror Coat has the highest score against Gengar of +4, and because +4 beats all the moves on Gardevoir, because its best move against Gardevoir is only +0, +4 is going to beat +0 in the doubles AI step. The doubles AI is going to see that Mirror Coat is a better move to use against Gengar than any move is to use against Gardevoir. And because of this, Gastrodon is guaranteed to use Mirror Coat in this scenario. Things can get even more complicated though. Consider facing the following enemies in doubles, Arcanine 1 and Ursaring 1. Both Arcanine 1 and Ursaring 1 are going to score all of their moves against both of the player's Pokemon, and all these moves can get a score. However, Arcanine and Ursaring will also score all of their moves against each other. Usually when the AI tries to use a move on its partner, it results in a score of -30, which is essentially never pick this. However, if Ursaring has Guts, then Arcanine's Will-O-Wisp is actually going to score +3 into its partner Ursaring. In other words, the AI likes to activate Guts using Will-O-Wisp when it possibly can. +3 as a score is quite likely to win as highest score overall, even including the player's Pokemon as targets, And so Arcanine 1 using Will-O-Wisp against Urswing 1 is actually quite likely here. Activating Guts on your ally like this is an example of something we're going to call Tag Strategy in doubles, and there are quite a lot of Tag Strategies in Generation 4 doubles. Now for the Frontier, the most important one to be aware of by far is the move Earthquake. Earthquake is a really important move to understand how its score changes in doubles. Most of the time in Generation 4 the AI is going to check to see if its ally has fainted, but there are some big exceptions to this. So let's quickly talk about Earthquake and Magnitude in doubles. As a special note, this check is going to run even if its most recent ally has fainted. So for example, if an Earthquaking enemy just had its Fire-type ally faint, it's very likely it can never use Earthquake again in the match, even though that Fire-type has now fainted. So the Earthquake Tag Strategy AI is that if the ally is immune to Earthquake, meaning it's a flying type, it has Levitate or it has Magnet Rise, Earthquake or Magnitude will get a score of +2. On the other hand, if the ally has a Fire, Electric, Poison or Rock typing, Earthquake or Magnitude will get a score of -10. Obviously this is a bit of a bug. Earthquake should check for Steel typing, but it does not. Another bug here is that Earthquake does not check for the overall type matchup into its ally. So for example, Shuckle is neutral to Earthquake, because while Rock is weak to Earthquake, Shuckle is also Bug type and Bug resists ground. So Shuckle is neutral to Earthquake, but because Shuckle specifically has a Rock type, Earthquake is still going to get a score of -10 when Shuckle is on the field. So an enemy Pokemon will almost never use the move Earthquake when Shuckle is its ally. Another really big one is Skill Swap. So the AI runs special Skill Swap checks in both singles and doubles. In doubles it's a bit more complicated though. The important abilities here are basically Truant and Slow Start. It'll try and skill swap these abilities off any kind of partner, and it'll always try and skill swap these abilities onto any kind of enemy. It also does some weird checks, like it checks if its ally is pure electric type and does not have Levitate, and if the user does have Levitate, it'll give it a score +2. These kind of skill swap scenarios are not very common though. The biggest one you're going to run into is that you might sometimes see skill swap be used against Slaking or Regigigas when those are the ally of the AI. So next up is Future Sight and Doom Desire. So the AI is not going to use this if the AI's partner also is faster than it and has the same move. There are also a lot of checks for weather in Generation 4. The way these weather checks work is they check both the Pokemon using the move and its ally for any kind of indication to boost the chance of using that move. Gravity is another big one. The AI checks all Pokemon on the field for gravity, and it checks to see whether or not they are Levitate on the flying type. If enemies are Levitate or flying, it likes to use gravity, and if allies are Levitate or flying, it likes to not use gravity. So Trick Room is fairly straightforward. This is just a speed check. It tries to rank all the Pokemon on the field in terms of speed, and then work out whether or not Trick Room would be advantageous for the AI to use. Follow Me is a very complicated check based on the HP of the attacker and the partner, which is the ally to the AI. Next up are checks for electric, fire and water moves. These are very similar to those checks we saw earlier. So in Generation 4, Discharge, Lava Plume and Surf hit all Pokemon on the field. The AI runs a very similar check to Earthquake to see if its partner is either going to have a type that's weak into this move, or if its partner has an ability that makes it immune to this move. Obviously when it does, this makes the move more likely to be used. Outside of these spread moves, there's also moves like Thunderbolt or Fire Blast. If the ally has a specific ability like Motor Drive or Flash Fire, the AI really likes trying to activate the ability on its partner. It'll often do this in situations which do not make a lot of sense at all. A similar thing happens for Volt Absorb, Water Absorb and Dry Skin, where the AI really likes trying to heal its ally with these moves. This is one of the most abusable parts of Generation 4 AI, and it is also a rare case in doubles where the AI can be quite predictable. So there's also Helping Hand. If the AI's partner knows Helping Hand, all of the AI's damaging moves get a score of +1. I mention this specifically because there are some fights in the Frontier and in the actual game where you're playing alongside the AI. So the player is controlling one Pokemon and the AI is controlling one Pokemon on your side, and you're facing two AI opponents. There is a real reason to teach your Pokemon Helping Hand if you want to boost the chance of your AI ally using damaging moves more often, which you probably do. This actually makes Helping Hand quite a good move to teach your Pokemon, even if you never intend to use it. So Will-O-Wisp, we went over the example with Guts earlier. This also applies to Flash Fire. Thunderwave has a similar check, where it treats Thunderwave similarly to most damaging electric moves, but it also checks for Lightning Rod and it checks for ground. There's also Toxic or any kind of poison status. It's important to note that this does not activate for Guts AI like it does in Gen 3. The only thing that triggers Guts is Will-O-Wisp. In Generation 4, Toxic or any kind of poison status move used on the ally only gets used to activate Poison Heal, which is obviously quite a rare ability. There's also swagger. The AI loves to swagger its ally, as long as its ally is holding either a lum or a Persianberry to cure the confusion. Note that swagger does not check for any kind of own tempo ability on its ally. There's also gastric acid, which is very similar to skill swap. The AI does like to try and remove the ability of its ally if its ally has a very bad ability, which is defined as truant or slow start. The final one is acupressure. Acupressure is a bit weird. It likes to use acupressure on its ally in certain situations. It depends on the ally's HP, and it also depends on if any of the ally stats have been boosted to +6 yet. That's a quick crash course in tag strategies and doubles though. Part of doubles AI, which is the fact that it does not do ally move prediction at all. Here's a famous example. Consider the AI has Slowbro and Slowking. These Pokemon both have Trick Room. They both want to use Trick Room because they both see each other as slower than both of the enemies. Critical to understand here is that both Slowbro and Slowking can use Trick Room on the same turn. Obviously, it's a bad idea to do this. This essentially removes Trick Room on the same turn it's used. Both Pokemon have wasted their turn. However, the AI does not check what its AI partner is going to use. So Slowbro does not check that Slowking is about to use Trick Room, and vice versa. This can lead to some very funny situations. For example, it is also not rare to see an enemy Pokemon use Sunny Day and its partner also use Sunny Day, or for an enemy Pokemon to use Sandstorm and then for its partner to use Sunny Day. Or indeed, both enemies might use the move Gravity. It also applies if the AI is your ally. It can easily do something you don't want it to do. You've got to be very careful in tag battles when you're teamed up with the AI. This is a small point, but it's something that newer players quite often wrongly assume about how the AI operates in doubles. Okay, so something I talk about a lot in Frontier streams is how deadly the Gen 4 doubles AI is. I've never fully explained why this is, but the next 3 sections are going to explain it in detail. So let's have a look. So first up we have something called Strongest Move, and this might be the single scariest part of Gen 4 doubles AI. The logic is actually quite simple. It is applied on top of all the regular singles logic, and it states that if the attack does the most damage to the target when compared to all of the user's moves, and all of the user's allies' moves when used by the ally, 50% chance of a score +1. Let's do an example so this is more obvious. Let's say I'm using Blissey 1. I'm facing Gengar 1 and Aerodactyl 1. Gengar's best move is Sludge Bomb, and Aerodactyl's best move is Aerial Ace. Obviously, Aerial Ace does a lot more damage than Sludge Bomb. So when Gengar is scoring Sludge Bomb, it'll never get a +1 score in this part of the AI against Blissey. Sludge Bomb is going to be stuck at +0. However, Aerodactyl is going to see that Aerial Ace is the strongest move against Blissey that Aerodactyl can do and Gengar can do. And therefore Aerial Ace has a 50% chance to get a +1 score against Blissey. This can lead to a table like this. So obviously Gengar's moves are being stuck at +0, but Aerodactyl can get promoted to +1. This is very rare for a regular attack to do. And it means the AI is specifically encouraging the use of the strongest attack in doubles. What is so deadly about this is the fact that the 50% chance is not deterministic. It's aggression, but it's random aggression. It's extremely difficult to play against this on equal footing. This also has another quiet consequence which makes the AI quite a lot more deadly in doubles. Let's return to the Aerodactyl versus Blissey scenario again. Let's say Blissey is around 190 HP. In other words, it's definitely going to die to Aerial Ace, but if Aerodactyl uses a weaker move, like a spread damage Rock Slide, Blissey is quite likely to survive. In singles, because both of these moves can kill Blissey, Aerodactyl will be 50-50 to either choose Rock Slide or Aerial Ace in this scenario. But in doubles, we have this +1 score for the overall strongest attack. And because +1 score is being applied to Aerial Ace and not Rock Slide, Aerodactyl is a lot more likely to use Aerial Ace against Blissey. In other words, Aerial Ace is quite likely to get a +5 score instead of a +4 score. You've also got to be really careful when this applies to moves like Trick. So earlier we said that the AI really likes using Trick with a Pokemon like Porygon Z2. Porygon Z2's Trick is going to score +5. In singles, its regular Tri-Attack can never score more than +4. But in doubles, obviously, if Tri-Attack is the strongest move on the field, Tri-Attack can score +5. This makes Porygon Z2 a lot more random in doubles. I will say, I think this kind of behaviour is very deadly, but also unintentional from Game Freak. I think what Game Freak wanted to do was something like, let's say it has Pokemon A and can deal 20% damage to Pokemon C or 50% damage to Pokemon D. Obviously, it's better to deal 50% damage to Pokemon D, we're doing more damage overall then. And let's say if Pokemon B is the inverse, we want it to attack Pokemon C. I think this is the intent of the code. However, what the code actually does is it makes the AI a lot more aggressive in doubles, and it also makes the AI quite a lot more random in doubles. And you've got to be really careful because this check can run even when the ally has fainted. So even if Aerodactyl has fainted, Gengar is not going to see the +1 score into Blissey. That might be a blessing and it might be a curse. It's very difficult to play around this. So the next big one is doubles AI type effectiveness. This is also a really big deal in doubles. The AI effectively runs 2 checks in this pass. First up, so long as the move doesn't kill the target, it will sometimes reduce the score of moves that are not very effective against that target. Another check, which is different, is it sometimes increases the chance of using a super effective move, whether or not that move is going to kill the target. Now, the doubles AI sometimes reducing the chance of not very effective moves is pretty innocent most of the time, but it can lead to some pretty funny moments. So consider the following matchup. Let's say we have Aggron and we are facing Slacking. Obviously, Slacking's Facade and Shadow Claw are not very effective against Aggron. So how does a not very effective AI actually work? So first up, if the move is regular not very effective, a 0.5 times multiplier, 75% chance for a score of -1, this would apply to Shadow Claw. And then if it's double not very effective, whoops. And then if it's double not very effective, then you get a 75% chance for a score of -2. This would apply to Facade against Aggron. This can lead to some pretty weird tables. For example, Slacking might be ending up with something like this, where Yawn has a score of +0, but both of the attacks get the 75% chance for a -1 score. In a scenario like this, Slacking is obviously incredibly likely to use Yawn and almost nothing else. This kind of scenario isn't that common, but let's imagine for a second that Slacking does not have the move Yawn, but instead just has a blank move slot here. Slacking's moves all score -1 into Aggron for being not very effective, and this means that Slacking is much more likely to score a +0 into Aggron's ally. In other words, because Slacking does not want to attack Aggron here, Aggron's ally is in a much higher danger of being hit by a move from Slacking 1. And also unfortunately, 75% chance is not 100% chance. It is very difficult to safely play around this. You just got to keep it in mind and hedge your bets based on the probability of these kind of scenarios. So next up is a much more evil one. This is super effective attack AI. A special note here, when we previously talked about highest damage on our side to an enemy in the previous section, if that scored +1, this check can't also pass. In more precise terms, what this logic does is that if it sees that an attack deals damage, and the attack did not get a +1 score in the previous check, if the type effectiveness is 2 times, 61% chance of a score +1, and the type effectiveness is 4 times, 75% chance of a score +1. And as a reminder, this effectiveness check is a little bit bugged. Let's look at an example. Let's say I have Vespiquen 4 against Exploud 4. Now, in singles, this is a very simple scenario. Exploud 4 is going to use Overheat. It's the strongest move against Vespiquen. In doubles, something slightly different can happen. Because Overheat and Ice Beam are both super effective, there is a chance, although not very likely, that Overheat does not score the +1 for super effective, and that Ice Beam goes to -1 for being weaker than Overheat, but then it scores +1 again for being super effective against Vespiquen. The chance of this is not very high, it's about 24%, and then if both moves score +0, Exploud has to randomly pick between the +0 scoring moves, so it's a 50-50 to pick Ice Beam or Overheat, but it can pick Ice Beam. Overall, we can say there's about a 12% chance in doubles, Exploud 4 uses Ice Beam against Vespiquen instead of Overheat against Vespiquen. This might sound like a good thing, but it's actually probably not a good thing. Again, we want the AI to behave deterministically. For example, perhaps we want to switch Vespiquen out and bring a Pokemon like Houndoom with Flash Fire in so it takes no damage from Overheat. Of course, in singles, this is safe to do. In doubles, it's not. 12% chance of Ice Beam, 10% chance of Ice Beam Freeze. Everyone who has played the Frontier knows that these kind of 1% scenarios do occasionally happen, and it can easily lead to a loss. Now, there is a reason I called a super effective doubles AI actually evil. Consider a matchup like this. Let's say we have Donphan 2, and we're facing Blastoise 2. Now, on the face of it, you might think this is a pretty bad matchup. And you're kind of right. Blastoise 2 is very likely to 2-shot Donphan with Waterfall. That's not good news for Donphan. Blastoise is also faster than Donphan, so you might think this is almost a guaranteed loss for Donphan. However, in singles, Donphan is actually quite likely to win this. And this is because in singles, Double Team and Aqua Wing both have a good chance of getting a boosted score against Donphan, particularly when Blastoise is in higher HP. The chance of Donphan using 3 Earthquakes while Blastoise wastes its time not using 2 Waterfalls is actually decently high. Donphan has a real chance of coming out of this matchup with a win. In doubles, it's very different. Unfortunately, Waterfall is obviously super effective as an attack against Donphan. This means that Waterfall has a chance of getting a +1 score against Donphan, and potentially beating Aquawing or Double Team in certain scenarios. Obviously, the earlier Blastoise 1 uses Waterfall, the earlier it will use a second Waterfall, the more likely Donphan is to faint. And this also works in tandem with the strongest overall move against Donphan on the field on Blastoise's side. There's a good chance that Waterfall is the strongest move on Blastoise and Blastoise's ally against Donphan, and therefore Waterfall can also get a +1 score from this. In other words, there's probably about an 80% chance that Waterfall scores +1 against Donphan too in doubles, and remember in singles it would never score +1. So I go over this more in the document, but basically in doubles, Donphan is dramatically more likely to lose this 1v1 against Blastoise. So what does this mean? It basically means the AI is more likely to use attacks in doubles than it is in singles. And because for most players you want deterministic behaviour from the enemy AI, or you want the AI to waste its turn on moves like Aquawing or Taunt, this is often a really bad thing for the player. It's the reason why the doubles AI in Gen 4 is a lot more deadly than the singles AI in Gen 4. Now I want to say for Frontier players, this doubles check is independent to Smart AI and independent to Basic AI. If you've ever played Gen 4 factory doubles, you'll be aware of how deadly the very early rounds are. There's a reason for this. The doubles AI is still running in the background. It's still prioritizing the use of super effective attacks, and it's still prioritizing the use of the most damaging attack possible on the field. In other words, the AI at the start of the factory doubles streak is often pseudo-random. It's biased towards using favourable attacks. But it still has a good pinch of randomness. This kind of randomness is horrible to play against, and it's part of why I really hate factory doubles in Generation 4. Now I mentioned it a little bit earlier with Porygon Z2, but you need to be really careful about singles assumptions. Let's consider the following Pokemon. So Medicham 1 in singles is actually quite a well-behaved Pokemon. It's very likely to use Fake Out on turn 1, then use Zen Headbutt, and then when it's low on HP, use Endure. In doubles, this is not true, because Zen Headbutt is very likely to score the highest damaging move, and Zen Headbutt can also score super effective AI against one of the enemies. This means that Zen Headbutt can be used over Fake Out on turn 1, even if Zen Headbutt doesn't kill the enemy. This dramatically changes how you would want to play against Medicham, and I will say that Medicham 1 is one of the Pokemon that changes the most in doubles compared to singles. Let's also look at another example. So Honchko 4 is somewhat famous for almost never using the move Sucker Punch. And this is true in singles. In doubles, because of super effective AI, Sucker Punch actually becomes quite a lot more likely. Of course, when super effective doubles AI is active for Sucker Punch, it'll also be triggering the Smart AI for Night Slash on high crit moves, but the overall effectiveness calculation is that Sucker Punch is more likely to be used. And of course, the fear when facing Honchko 4 is indeed the fear that Sucker Punch is used at all against the player. And it's made even worse by the fact that we know that Sucker Punch is only prioritised in doubles against super effective matchups. In other words, when you most want Sucker Punch not to happen against you. So next up is what I'm going to call Priority Preference. This is very rare in the Frontier, but it's probably less rare in certain ROM hacks. The way this works is that if the priority attack is the strongest attack into that target in doubles, instead of a 50% chance of a +1 score we saw earlier, it's actually going to be an 80.5% chance of a +1 score. Now this is rare because priority attacks are quite weak. A Pokemon like Lapras 1 obviously never is going to see Ice Shard as doing the most damage. But it's not unheard of. For example, Seal 1 is very likely to be scoring +1 in these kind of checks early on in the factory. Now I don't want to repeat myself, but multi-target moves are really important doubles. Of course, this includes Earthquake, Discharge, Lava Plume and Surf. These are the moves with special AI in doubles. They're really important to be aware of because in a lot of cases, the AI is almost forced to use them or forced to not use them, depending on what the ally is doing. So I'm going to do a special shout out to the best moves in doubles. These are Protect, Endure and Fake Out. Why are these moves so good? They're basically the only time you're actually going to buy free turns against the AI in doubles. Of these, Fake Out is the most flexible and reliable. Obviously, you can use Fake Out against a very deadly opponent and make sure that opponent is not going to get an action in on that turn. On the same turn, your ally is going to hopefully take out that opponent or cripple them in some way. Another thing I want to mention about Fake Out, and this is not really viable in the Frontier, is that if you have at least 3 Pokemon and they all have the move Fake Out, you can use Fake Out on one of them against an opponent, switch the other one out, and then keep repeating this forever. You'll essentially always be using Fake Out against the enemy, and they'll always be flinching. You can only do this when there is one enemy left, of course. Now I want to shout out Pichao. I did see this in one of his YouTube shorts, and this is where I got the idea from. In general, I would say Protect and Endure are potentially better moves in doubles though. If you have a Pokemon that is about to die, or some kind of underlevel Pokemon, or just a very weak Pokemon, if you teach it Endure or Protect, you can likely bait attacks from both enemies into it, so long as your partner also isn't vulnerable to being KO'd. Obviously, this buys an entire free turn against both enemies, and even after Protect is used, it can be maybe used again. On that turn, you might be able to set up a way to get 2 kills in one turn, making sure the protect Pokemon has more time. Or you might be able to use a move like Trick Room, making sure that your weaker Pokemon is potentially able to act first, and then you can knock out both Pokemon in the same turn. This is famously what the best Battle Tower doubles teams do with a level 1 Smeargle. I want to add a note though, you want to be careful of using Protect and thinking you're always safe doing it. Let's say we have a Pokemon like Roserade 2, and a Pokemon using Protect is a Flying type. Even if Giga Drain sees a kill into that Flying type Pokemon, Giga Drain is only going to get a +1 score, because Giga Drain gets deprioritized into targets that resist the move. Obviously, Giga Drain at +1 is still going to be used over any other move, unless the ally to your Pokemon is also weak to Grass. Suddenly then, super effective AI can get triggered in doubles, and Giga Drain can get its +1 to that target as well. So as an example, let's say I have a level 2 Togekiss and a level 50 Slowbro. Roserade 2 is going to see Giga Drain as +1 into Togekiss because it can kill, but it's also going to see Giga Drain as +1 into Slowbro sometimes because Giga Drain is super effective into Slowbro. So yeah, always double check that the bait is going to work if you're going to go for these kind of endure protect strategies. Now the doubles spread damage bug is the most important bug in Gen 4 doubles, and I do not see this get discussed enough. This bug is basically the entire reason why my doubles castle team works so well. I'll leave a link to this in the description. But let's do a clean example for the sake of this guide. Let's say I'm using Golem 4 in doubles. Golem 4 obviously has the move Earthquake and Explosion. Let's say I'm facing Torterra 2 and Entei 4. Now, for the purpose of this guide, let's pretend that Golem isn't slower than these two, or let's pretend that if these two use a move, Golem is going to survive the move. Let's say Golem's ally is going to use Protect, and let's say that I want to explode with Golem. Let's do the damage calc for that. So first up, Golem's explosion is not guaranteed to kill Torterra. The spread damage nerf on explosion slightly reduces the damage below the threshold needed to kill. But on the other hand, my explosion is guaranteed to kill Entei. Entei 4 of course is slightly less bulky than Torterra 2. So you might expect that I explode, Entei will die, and Torterra might live or it might die depending on this damage roll. So what actually happens is very different to this. First up, Golem dies. It uses explosion, its HP gets set to 0 instantly. It has fainted. Next up, the fastest Pokemon on the field is going to get hit by explosion. For argument's sake, let's say this is Entei. Entei gets hit first by explosion, Entei faints. The only Pokemon on the field left now are my partner Pokemon that has used Protect, and the enemy Torterra. Next, explosion hits Torterra, and Torterra 2 is going to die. The explosion spread damage nerf is not applied to Torterra as it gets hit by explosion. So why does this happen? This is a really important bug. It happens because the spread damage calculation is actually dynamic. When we use a spread damage move in doubles, the doubles engine checks whether or not this is currently doubles, and if it is doubles, it applies a spread damage nerf. Now the question is, how do we decide if it's a doubles battle or not? It's actually very simple. If there are 3 or 4 unfated Pokemon on the field, it's a doubles battle. All of the spread attacks will be nerfed by 25% damage, as always. But if the count of unfated Pokemon is 2, it's actually going to be singles, and there is no spread penalty in singles. Golem and Entei faint first. There are now 2 Pokemon left, and Torterra is going to take the max damage from explosion. It's not going to have the spread damage nerf. It doesn't matter that Golem used the move, Golem has now fainted. It's really important to notice as well, this does not just apply to explosion. It also applies to any kind of spread damage move, and it also applies when the enemy or when the player is using these moves. So there's a few things that are really important to be aware of with spread damage. First up, the fastest Pokemon on the field gets hit first, but Quick Claw can interfere with this. If a Pokemon has a Quick Claw, there's a 20% chance Quick Claw activates during the explosion, and that Pokemon gets hit first by the attack. So if Torterra 2 had the item Quick Claw, 20% of the time, my explosion hits Torterra 2 before Entei, and Torterra 2 takes a spread damage nerf explosion. A similar thing happens in the case of a speed tie. If 2 Pokemon speed tie, it's going to be random which one the spread damage target is going to hit first. Trick Room operates similarly. Under Trick Room, Torterra will be hit before Entei by explosion. Torterra will be considered the faster Pokemon under Trick Room. This is not unique to explosion. Let's say I use Surf and I knock out my ally, and I also knock out an enemy. In this case, my Pokemon with Surf and the final enemy are the only Pokemon on the field in doubles, and Surf does full damage to that single target. The same would apply to something like Discharge or something like Lava Plume, or indeed something like Magnitude or Earthquake. You need to be really, really careful with this interaction. It comes up a lot of the time in any kind of close match. Perhaps in a Nuzlocke your Pokemon isn't fainting quite as much, but in Frontier this kind of interaction where a lot of Pokemon faint is very common. You want to be very careful, particularly with the move Explosion used by enemies. So that's the end of the doubles section. I will say doubles in Gen 4 is really hard. You probably understand a bit more why I say this now on stream so much. I want to end out this video with my top 20 battle tips and insights from years of play. This applies to both singles and doubles, but it's really more applying to singles. What's really important to understand is that this is not a complete list of every single interaction with the AI. It's just a list of things I feel like come up very often. So first up, I'm repeating myself slightly here. Remember strongest move, remember the fundamental law of kill AI, and remember that there are moves that ignore this. Let's look at two famous examples from the Frontier. So here's Dragonite 4. It has a choice band. It has 4 very powerful moves. However, Dragonite 4 is never going to use Giga Impact or Superpower at full HP. These are not kill moves, and they're also moves that get deprioritized at high HP. Dragonite 4 is always going to use Outrage or Earthquake, which makes it a lot more predictable, even if it's still quite deadly. A similar thing happens with Rampardos 4. Rampardos 4 is either going to Head Smash or Earthquake in almost every scenario. It'll never use Giga Impact, it'll almost never use Superpower. Now the reason why Rampardos and Dragonite is so predictable is because of their choice items. They get locked into the move on the early turns. But consider a Pokemon like Empoleon 4. So Empoleon 4 can't use Hydro Cannon at max HP. However, Empoleon 4 does not have any kind of choice item. If you get Empoleon 4 low on HP, it can very easily use Hydro Cannon against you. So the next thing, and I'm slightly repeating myself again, is on Kill AI specifically. Remember the moves that beat Kill AI. Trick plus Choice Scarf is an example of a move that will always beat Kill AI. So Porygon Z2 is always going to use Trick, it'll never use Tri-Attack on the first turn of the match. And here's another case. So Ampharos versus Pelipper. You might be wondering, surely Ampharos just uses Thunderbolt against Pelipper. Thunderbolt is going to kill Pelipper, isn't that the best thing to do? Doesn't it have Kill AI? You've got to be really careful in situations like this. Pelipper is faster than Ampharos. This means that Thunder Wave is going to get a +3 score. The AI likes using Thunder Wave when it's slower. However, Thunder Wave is also 4 times super effective against Pelipper. Yes, Thunder Wave is a status move, but no, it doesn't matter. It can still get a +2 score from being 4 times super effective. If it gets that +2 score and that +3 score, Thunder Wave can score +5 against Pelipper, beating Thunderbolt at only +4. This is quite common, particularly with the Pokemon Gyarados in the Frontier. A similar thing can happen with other status moves. So pretend for a second that Mamoswine has the ability Ice Body. The move Hail can get a +2 score when it's 4 times super effective against a Pokemon like Garchomp, and Hail can also stack with Ice Body in Smart AI. This can bring Hail up to a +4 score in some scenarios. The next one is flaws in the Kill AI. Again, I'm retreading familiar ground, but I just want to say this again. So for example, if we have Gliscor and the enemy has Frostlass, Frostlass does not understand that Ice Punch does not kill Gliscor. It does not understand that Gliscor has a Yachi Berry and that this reduces the damage of Ice Punch. It is always going to go for Ice Punch here because Ice Punch is seen as a kill move against Gliscor. Another really important one to be aware of is Life Orb. There are a few Pokemon with Life Orb in the Frontier. They quite regularly catch newer players out by not using kill moves. Ambipom 3 is a good example of this Life Orb example. It's also a good example of double hit. So Technician, Life Orb, Ambipom 3's double hit does massive damage. It's very scary to face in the factory. However, you've got to remember that Ambipom does not understand that double hit hits twice. It's actually extremely rare for Ambipom to use the move double hit. So the next big generalization I'm going to do is Setup AI. Setup AI works quite well in general. This includes moves like Sword Stance, Double Team, and Calm Mind. The way the AI works is it prefers to use these moves at higher HP, and it generally becomes impossible to use these moves when it's at very low HP. Playing as Setup AI is very important but not always completely intuitive. A broad rule for Pokemon is that you want to switch into your good type matchups, but this can be an exception to that. Let's say we're facing a Pokemon with Double Team. We know it's going to use Double Team. We might want to attack it first, just so we get it low on HP and reduce the chance it uses more Double Teams in the future. If we take the opportunity to switch and then also use a move, that would be 2 turns it's sitting at full HP, 2 turns it's very likely to use Double Team. You want to be really careful about ordering moves correctly against setup opponents. And I will say part of the big difficulty of the Frontier, and the Factory in particular, is juggling a chance of the enemy Pokemon being a setup set versus the chance of them just being a regular attacking set. It is very difficult to assess the outcome and assess the branching paths of probability here, and try and come up with the overall best plan against many possible outcomes. Now I talked about Setup AI, there is one major exception to Setup AI, which is Curse. So Curse is kind of broken. It does not actually look at the user's HP when it's considering whether or not it wants to use Curse. This can be both a blessing and a curse for the player. It can lead to easy wins when enemy Pokemon with Curse uses Curse at very low HP just before it's about to die, but it also can lead to some extremely scary scenarios, when the AI is using Curse at middling HP, denying you a kill and then going into recovery moves. I also mentioned this before, but again, ability checking, you must know how this works. Most of the time, the AI does not know your ability. It's going to guess you have a random ability. Let's look at an example. Let's say we've got Gliscor. Let's say the AI is considering using Charm against Gliscor. So 50% of the time, the AI will assume that Gliscor is Hypercutter, and it won't use Charm against Hypercutter. And 50% of the time, the AI might assume that Gliscor is Sandvale, and it can potentially use Charm against Sandvale. It will continue to do this randomly until it sees text like Charm failed because of Hypercutter. Once it sees this text, it now knows your Gliscor has Hypercutter. Of course, if you switch Gliscor out, it will completely forget that your Gliscor has Hypercutter. In the frontier, this is probably most relevant for Skarmory. So Skarmory isn't guaranteed to have Sturdy, so even if you're in against an enemy Pokemon with an OHKO move, you cannot safely switch out. At least, you cannot safely switch out until the enemy uses an OHKO move against Skarmory, hits the OHKO move, and the text appears that the OHKO move failed because of Sturdy. Once this happens, the AI is never going to use an OHKO move on Skarmory again while it's still in. It's also really important to know that the AI does not do any kind of deductive reasoning. Let's say I've got a heat-proof Bronzong. Let's say the enemy uses a fire move against my Bronzong and it doesn't do very much damage. Now, if the enemy was a human, they'd look at that and go, oh, it must be a heat-proof Bronzong, it must not have Levitate. The AI is not going to do this. The AI does not look at the reduced damage from heatproof and say that this must be a heatproof Bronzong and it can't be Levitate. This means my heatproof Bronzong is always going to be randomly guessed as being Levitate 50% of the time. And this actually leads us to quite an important conclusion for the frontier. Even if your Pokemon has the wrong ability, it gets a bit of protection from the fact that it might have an ability. A famous example of this is Lantern. Volt Absorb Lantern is way better than Illuminate Lantern, of course. But against the enemy AI, even if you have Illuminate, about half the time, the AI is going to assume that you're actually Volt Absorb. So Lantern is kind of protected against electric attacks just because the AI thinks that you might be Volt Absorb, even though you're not it. So here's another one which might be a little bit dangerous to include. So as a general rule, most status moves in the game sit at +0. Most status moves don't have any kind of check apart from checking that they're useless. So if you don't want to spend ages looking at guides and websites, you can probably assume that most status moves are going to be stuck at +0, as long as they're not any kind of setup move or any kind of other move listed in this article. Okay, so this is the really big one. Let's talk about Substitute. This is probably the most famous frontier exploit. The AI is basically completely blind to the fact that you have a substitute in every way that matters. This means if I have a substitute up against an enemy, the enemy might spam Thunder Wave 10 turns in a row against me. It will never learn this. It will never realise that Thunder Wave is failing because of my substitute. It will just continue stupidly spamming Thunder Wave against me. This probably makes Substitute the best move in the entire game against the enemy AI. It just buys you so much free turns. And combined with the fact that so many Pokemon can learn Substitute, it makes Substitute probably the single most used move in the entire frontier. Now this also applies to damage. Let's say I have a Suicune with 1 HP left. It's going to die to any move. I'm facing an enemy which has an attack that deals 60 damage to Suicune, and another attack that deals 20 damage to Suicune. Because both of these moves would kill Suicune if I did not have a substitute, it's going to be random which one can be picked. Even though as humans we can see this and know that the weaker move isn't going to break the Suicune substitute, and therefore the stronger move should be picked, the AI does not understand that Suicune has a substitute here. It just thinks I have a 1 HP Suicune. And of course, and this more applies to Nuzlocke, substitute is an incredibly safe way of dealing damage to yourself. As you substitute down lower and lower in HP, you will eventually enter kill range for one of these enemies' moves. Once it sees that kill, you can then safely switch into a Pokemon that can either resist or is immune to that attack. Substitute is also just the best safety net ever in the game. It's the best protection you have against Quick Claw while trying to sweep. It's also the best protection you have against something like a Bright Powder Miss. The fact that you get another turn as they break the substitute is huge. So another big example is speed control. As a generalization, the AI loves to be faster than you. If it has any kind of move that influences speed, it loves to use it. Moves like Thunder Wave, Scary Face, Agility, Icy Wind, Trick Room, these are all incredibly likely to be used if they can make the enemy faster than you. Generally, these moves can only be beaten by kill AI. So we mentioned it before, but some moves are impossible to use at high health. Very important on this list are Hyper Beam and Hyper Beam-like moves and Superpower. You should be very afraid of being hit by these moves, but these moves cannot be chosen at full HP on an enemy unless the enemy has no other viable moves that can score decently against the player. I'll also put in a quick note about Truant plus Recharge, which do have a special interaction in the AI. Let's also talk about OHKO AI. This is probably the most infamous AI in the Frontier. Unfortunately, unlike Gen 3, these moves do run smart AI in Gen 4. 25% of the time, they give a score of +1. This means for a Pokemon like Donphan 4, Fissure is actually quite likely to be used. It'll be around 60% chance to use Fissure unless Earthquake or another move already kills the enemy. There is not a lot you can do about OHKO moves in the Frontier. Sturdy, of course, is quite rare and is not on many good Pokemon in Gen 4. Your best chance against OHKO moves is probably either to get an immunity against them or to use the move Substitute. Here's another incredibly annoying one. So high crit AI is a bit notorious. If a high crit move is neutral, it has a 25% chance for a +1 score. If they are super effective, they have a 50% chance for a +1 score. So for example, Machamp, even if Dynamic Punch is the strongest move against the enemy, it can still sometimes use Stone Edge, because Stone Edge is weaker, but it can also get a +1 score for being high crit. A similar thing can happen with Machamp 4 and Cross Chop instead of Earthquake. It is really difficult to play against these Pokemon. Again, you have to weigh up the exact odds of them picking what move and decide on what the best overall course of action is against these Pokemon. But be really careful about high crit AI when it comes to switches. A Pokemon with Stone Edge can easily randomly use this move when you're not expecting it to. Another big one is Countercoat. So Countercoat is famously very bugged in Generation 3 and this bug still exists in Generation 4. And the bug is this. Before the physical special split, Counter and Mirror Coat are supposed to check your type and match it against a type of known special and physical types. For example, what is intended to happen is to use Counter more often against Taurus, since Taurus is a normal type, and normal type is a physical type in Generations 1 to 3. But this check is actually backwards. So instead of encouraging Counter against Taurus, Mirror Coat is going to be encouraged versus Taurus. Obviously, Gen 4 is after the physical special split, but this still remains somewhat useful. It means that, for example, on turn 1, if Latios is out, and remember Latios is Dragon and Psychic, which are two special types in Generation 3, an enemy with Counter is very likely to use Counter and potentially waste the turn. The AI also prefers to use Counter or Mirror Coat after using an attack of the correct category. This check is not bugged. You want to be careful about Countercoat though, because it's very rarely truly predictable. You can only identify scenarios where it's quite unlikely to be picked or quite likely to be picked. So let's quickly talk about Explosion and Destiny Bond. These moves are obviously incredibly dangerous in Nuzlocke, they're obviously incredibly dangerous in the Frontier as well. We don't want to trade with the enemy on their terms. Sometimes trading is fine, particularly in the factory, but we want to trade on our terms. So let's talk about Explosion and Self-Destruct first. First up, they have a bit of an update from Gen 3. A full health explosion is now very rare, it's around 2%, although 2% might sound terrifyingly high if you're going for a very, very long streak. So the things to become aware of for Explosion. First up, Explosion becomes more likely the lower in HP the enemy gets, and the really big turning point is 50% HP. If possible, do not hit the enemy below 50% HP unless you know you can kill them on the following turn. Next up, the AI does check how many Pokemon are left on both sides. If the AI is on their last Pokemon and you are not on your last Pokemon, they're very unlikely to explode. However, you need to be very careful about doubles. In a 2v2 scenario, the AI will think that it still has an ally alive even though the ally is on the field. Of course, in reality, if it explodes here, it probably kills everything, but the rather simple AI algorithm does not care about that. So be very careful of Explosion in endgame double scenarios. So next up is Destiny Bond. I think Destiny Bond is in many ways much scarier than Explosion. Luckily, the distribution of the move Destiny Bond is much rarer in the Frontier, and it's quite rare on Pokemon that also have the item Quick Claw. Some quick pointers about Destiny Bond. The AI will almost never Destiny Bond at full HP. The Destiny Bond is stuck at a -1 score. Like Explosion, Destiny Bond does get more likely at lower HP. The most important thing though, Destiny Bond does not check if this is the AI's final Pokemon. The AI does not explode very often on its final Pokemon, but if it's got one Pokemon left, it's very likely to still use Destiny Bond. This means in an endgame 1v1 scenario in the factory, if you're facing an enemy that is faster and has to move Destiny Bond, you need to be very careful about how you kill this. And finally, the AI will happily spam Destiny Bond. Of course, Destiny Bond doesn't fail if used in succession, but there's no logic like, oh, the player didn't attack me last turn, so I'm not going to use Destiny Bond this turn. The AI Destiny Bond logic is purely run on the remaining HP percentage. So my voice is dying, I'm not sure if I can get through these fast enough. So let's talk about Roar and Haze. This is a very useful move to know because the player does like setting up against Roar and Haze. Basically, Haze and Roar both check if you've been boosted to +3 in one or more of your stats. Now you can still boost to +3, for example you could use 3 Dragon Dances, But just make sure, after you use 3 Dragon Dances, on the following turn, that you can immediately kill the enemy, because on that turn is a turn they're very likely to use Haze or Roar. Roar also has an additional check. Basically, it checks if you've been in for 4 or more turns. Once you've been in for 4 or more turns, Roar becomes incredibly likely. It's an 87.5% chance that Roar gets a score above +0. So some quick notes on healing. Probably one of the biggest bugs in the entire game is the fact that if the enemy is faster than you, the enemy is not going to use 50% healing moves. So for example, if the enemy has Cresselia and Cresselia has Moonlight, the enemy Cresselia is not going to use Moonlight if it is faster than your Pokemon. You can abuse this as long as you have a Pokemon that is slower than them. The same check does not apply to Rest though. Rest does have different behaviour based on whether or not the AI is faster or slower than the player though. When it is faster, the key HP percentage is 40%, and when it is slower, the key percentage is 60%. This is quite easy to take advantage of. It's quite easy to knock a Pokemon below 60% and therefore force them to use Rest again. In the time they're using Rest, you can potentially use a setup move, or you can potentially switch to another Pokemon. So here's a big one, Endure Reversal. Endure Reversal sets are very deadly, because most of them also run the item Selakberry. There's 2 big key insights here. First up, Reversal does not have kill AI. Reversal doesn't even do a proper damage comparison. Instead, Reversal just gets more likely at lower HP. You want to be very, very careful about dealing damage to an enemy Reversal or Flail set if the damage would bring them close to 20% or lower HP. Endure also has very dumb AI. Endure AI does not check whether or not the Pokemon just use Endure. This means the enemy can easily Endure for 3 or 4 turns in a row. Endure just becomes more likely at lower HP. Between 4 and 35% specifically is a time when Endure is much more likely. However, Endure is never deterministic in the same way that Reversal is at low HP. Of all the sets in the Frontier, this is probably the most punching set to misplay into. So U-Turn is another big one. U-Turn is just very complicated. Let's go over some quick pointers on it. So the AI is not going to use U-Turn if U-Turn is resisted. U-Turn does have regular kill AI though. It can be used as a regular kill move. If the user has a super effective move versus the target, including the move U-Turn, U-Turn becomes very unlikely. And also U-Turn is more likely at higher HP. The more damage you deal to a Pokemon with U-Turn, the less likely it is to U-Turn against you. And U-Turn is also a lot more likely if the AI is faster than the target. What makes U-Turn very complicated is the fact that U-Turn also runs a comparison between the damage on all moves in the back when used by the user. Similar to what we saw in Switch AI. This can make predicting U-Turn, particularly against an unknown team, exceptionally difficult to do. Luckily, I will say that most U-Turn Pokemon in the Frontier are pretty bad, and the one very good U-Turn in the Frontier is very unlikely to use U-Turn because close combat is so likely to score as the highest damaging move. So let's go with Facade quickly. Facade is broken in 2 ways. First up, the damage check is broken, it doesn't double properly, but also Facade does have special smart AI, so it checks if the target has a status condition and not the user. This is quite a big bug, obviously. Because Facade almost never wins strongest damage check without stab, the Facade users that you're going to run into are pretty much exclusively Pokemon like Exploud 2, which only use Facade because it's already the strongest move. Using a status move against a Pokemon with Facade is actually quite unlikely to be punished unless it already sees Facade as the strongest move against you. So next up, Weather and Solarbeam. Some important points here. Solarbeam does not have kill AI in Gen 4, it is not considered a kill move. The Gen 3 Weather bug does not exist in Gen 4, and also the AI can be really stupid with Solarbeam. A human would almost always use Sunny Day and then Solarbeam. The AI can easily just ignore this, and just use Solarbeam before Sunny Day, even if it already has Sunny Day on the same set. So Disable and Encore are very, very annoying moves. Disable is just incredibly likely to be spammed for reasons I won't get into in depth here. Encore is also much more likely if the enemy user is faster than you, or if you've just been disabled. Of course, with Disable and Encore, we're really talking about Dugong 2 specifically. Dugong 2 is quite evil, and actually, ironically, is a Pokemon that is better the better your team is, particularly in a facility like the Battle Tower. And finally, I'm going to mention Protect. Gen 4 fixes the famous Gen 3 Protect counter bug, and it also removes a guaranteed +1 score when the Protect counter is at 0. So basically, Gen 3's broken Protect does not apply in Gen 4. Protect, of course, is a very annoying move to face, and it has 2 very notable users, an Ursaring 3 and Swampert 1. Outside of this, Protect is not a very relevant move. I am rushing this video to try and help all of the Platinum Kaizo players. I am probably not playing Platinum Kaizo, but I also appreciate there isn't great documentation on the Gen 4 AI so far on the internet, and hopefully this can be that for them. I suspect because of that, this video is going to have minimal editing, and I do apologise for that. I'm going to return to regular videos after this.